Hey friend, come in, get settled. Pull the blanket up just a little higher and let the light in the room fade down to almost nothing. I have been thinking about tonight's story for a long time longer than I probably should admit. It starts with an insult, a small human aching insult said by one heartbroken man 700 years ago. And somehow that one sentence became the story every history book, every classroom and every movie still tells you today. If this is your first night here with me, welcome. Get comfortable, because where we're going tonight you will want to stay a while. Here is something almost nobody tells you. The 1,000 years that history calls the Dark Ages were never actually dark, and the man who convinced the entire world they were was not a historian. He never studied the centuries he condemned. He was not even trying to write history at all. He was a poet standing alone in the ruins of a city he loved, mourning a world he thought was already gone. Tonight we go back to the exact moment one grieving heart became 1,000 years of lies. But before we step into his story together, if nights like this one have ever kept you company, a quiet like a small subscribe or even a comment means more than you would guess. It tells me someone real is actually out there listening in the dark with me. And I would love to know something simple. Where are you tonight, and what time is it where you're curled up in bed driving home, or just needing something calm before the world gets loud again? Tell me below. I look through every single comment, even the short ones, even just a hello. Now let the lights go a little lower one more time. If you have a fan nearby, turn it on, let it hum softly behind us. Let that quiet sound hold you steady while I hold the story. Ready? Let us begin. This story does not start on a battlefield or inside a castle. It starts on a mountain in the south of France with a young man who could not stop looking up. His name was Francesco Petrarch, and in the year 1336 he did something almost nobody in his world had ever done before. He climbed a mountain for no reason at all, not to pray, not to fight, not to build anything on top of it. Just to see what the world looked like from up there. Historians still sometimes call it the first climb ever made purely for the view, which if you think about it makes Petrarch history's very first tourist. No selfie stick required. The mountain was called Ventoux, a name that even now means something close to the Restless One, because of how wildly the air moves across its bare, pale slopes. Petrarch brought his younger brother a walking stick and one small book tucked inside his coat, the Confessions of Augustine, a writer who'd been gone for almost 1,000 years but who Petrarch talked to in letters, like an old friend who simply happened to be dead. He was 31 years old, and already something inside him ached in a very particular way. You see, Petrarch had grown up surrounded by law and business. His father wanted him to become a notary the same as him, but every spare hour Petrarch buried himself in older books instead. Cicero, Livy, Virgil, writers from a Rome that had vanished 1,000 years before he was born. He took in their sentences the way some people pore over old love letters, and slowly, without meaning to, he fell in love with a world he could never actually visit. That is the quiet joke sitting underneath this entire story. The man who is remembered for damning an entire age spent his whole life homesick for one he had never actually inhabited. At the top of Mont Ventoux, Petrarch later wrote, he stood looking out at the clouds beneath his feet, at rivers turned to thin silver threads, at the shapes of distant mountains folding into the sky. It should have been the peak of his life, and for a moment it was. Then, almost on impulse, he opened his little copy of Augustine and let his eyes fall on a random page, the way people sometimes do when they want the universe to answer a question they have not quite asked yet. The line he found said roughly that people travel far to admire the height of mountains, the vastness of the ocean, the wide sweep of rivers, and yet they walk right past the mystery of their own hearts without a second look. Petrarch shut the book. He did not say much. His brother later remembered him going quiet, staring out at the view he had just climbed so far to see, but somehow not seeing it anymore. Something had shifted. The mountain suddenly felt smaller than the question sitting inside his own chest. They walked back down in near silence, the light fading fast behind them, the whole valley slipping into shadow far below. His brother said almost nothing the rest of the way. Petrarch himself later admitted in a letter describing that day that he kept glancing back over his shoulder, half expecting the mountain to somehow look different now that something inside him had changed. I think that moment tells you almost everything about who Petrarch was. He was not a man who simply loved old books. He was a man endlessly comparing himself, his century, his choices, his entire world, to something older, something he had decided was better, purer, more whole. And once you start measuring your own life against a golden memory, it becomes very hard to feel like you're living in anything but its shadow. 9 years later, that feeling found new fuel. In the year 1345, inside a quiet cathedral library in the city of Verona, Petrarch found a stack of forgotten letters, dusty, uncatalogued, mostly ignored by everyone else who worked there. He opened them, and his hands were probably shaking because what he was looking through were private letters written by Cicero himself to his closest friend almost 1400 years earlier. Picture that for a second. Imagine finding a box of someone's actual unfiltered messages, not their famous speeches, not their polished public writing, but their real voice worried about money, gossiping about rivals, doubting themselves at 2 a.m. That is what Petrarch was holding. At first he was overjoyed. It must have felt like mail from a friend who'd been gone for over 1,000 years. But the more he studied those letters, the more his hero started to crack open in his hands. This was not the calm, wise philosopher Petrarch had built up in his imagination for 20 years. This Cicero was anxious, political, sometimes petty, sometimes afraid, sometimes cruel about people he disliked. He was, in short, human. And here is the part I find almost tender in a sad sort of way. Petrarch actually sat down and wrote Cicero a letter back, knowing full well the man could never receive it. Scolding him gently for not living up to the perfect image Petrarch had spent his whole life admiring. That is not really a letter to a dead Roman statesman. That is a young man quietly grieving the difference between the story he had fallen in love with and the far messier truth underneath it. 5 years before that, something else had already happened to him, something that makes this whole story even harder to sit with. In the spring of the year 1341, on Easter morning, Petrarch climbed a different kind of hill. Not Ventoux this time, but the Capitoline Hill right in the heart of Rome. A crowd gathered below him. A senator placed a wreath of laurel leaves on his head, crowning him poet laureate, the highest literary honour his world could offer, in a ceremony deliberately built to echo the old triumphs of ancient emperors and poets. Nobody in Rome had received that honour in over 1,000 years. Petrarch himself helped design the whole event right down to the speech he gave because he wanted it to feel like something out of the Rome he had only ever known through old books. For one single morning, standing on that hill with leaves resting on his hair, he must have felt like he had actually stepped backward into the golden age he loved so much. Then the ceremony ended and he had to walk back down into the actual city around him. The city that once held over 1 million people had shrunk down to somewhere around 30,000. Cattle grazed in what used to be the Roman Forum, the beating political heart of an empire. Marble was quietly stripped from old temples to patch up newer, plainer buildings. Grand structures built to outlast the centuries stood half swallowed by weeds, visited mostly by pilgrims, goats, and silence. Petrarch walked through those ruins and wept. He was openly crying according to his own letters, not because Rome was ugly, but because he could feel so clearly exactly how much had been lost. He was not imagining decline. In a very physical, very real sense, he was standing inside it, So when Petrarch finally sat down in the year 1359 to write a private letter to a friend named Agapito Colonna, he was not making some grand, careful, scholarly judgment about an entire era of European history. He was simply saying no to a request. Agapito had apparently asked him to include a few recent modern names in a history he was writing. Petrarch turned him down gently, and in doing so he wrote a single sentence that would somehow outlive both of them by 700 years. He said he did not wish for the sake of a few names to guide his pen so far, through so much darkness. That was it. That was the whole moment. A tired, grieving poet describing his own personal heartbreak over how far his century had fallen, from the Rome he loved tucked inside one private letter, to one specific friend about one small request. He never meant it as a verdict on an entire 1,000 years of human life. He never studied medieval farming or medicine or law or art closely enough to make that kind of claim. He was talking about Latin literature, about his own homesickness for a version of Rome he had only ever met through books. But words like that do not usually just vanish. Sometimes they wait. Almost 250 years later, in the year 1602, a churchman named Caesar Baronius picked the phrase back up and used it to describe one especially chaotic stretch of the 10th and 11th centuries. Around 100 years still, after that, thinkers of what we now call the Age of Enlightenment, men like Voltaire and the English historian Edward Gibbon, reached for that same old metaphor of darkness and stretched it far beyond anything Petrarch ever intended. For them, darkness was not really about Latin grammar anymore. It became a weapon aimed squarely at the church, at faith itself, at nearly 1,000 years of European life they wanted to paint as one long, ignorant sleep before reason finally woke everyone back up. And somewhere in that retelling, an entire civilization, its farmers, its builders, its mothers, its scholars, its quiet everyday joys got flattened down into a single convenient word. Dark. Here is the strange, almost funny truth sitting underneath all of it. If you trace the phrase the Dark Ages all the way back to its very first use, you would not land on a historian. You would not land on evidence or data or careful research at all. You would land on one grieving man alone on a mountain, or standing in a ruined forum missing a world he'd only ever loved from a distance. I think about that a lot, honestly. How something so personal, so specific to one lonely heart, could quietly turn into common knowledge for the next 7 centuries. It kind of makes you wonder what other things we accept as simple fact were really just someone's very old, very human feeling repeated so many times, it eventually got mistaken for the truth. Maybe you know that feeling too in a smaller way. That quiet habit of comparing your own ordinary Tuesday to some golden version of the past. A simpler year, an easier season of your life, a time that probably was not nearly as perfect as your memory insists it was. Petrarch just happened to do it loudly enough and beautifully enough that the whole world eventually believed him. And that is where we are going together for the rest of this journey. Not to erase the hard parts of this era because there were real hard parts, but to gently pull back the curtain Petrarch accidentally hung over an entire age and actually look at what was standing behind it. Because it turns out the deeper you look, the less that world resembles darkness at all. And strangely enough, the very first lie waiting for us on the other side of that curtain has nothing to do with grief or Rome or lost letters. It has to do with something far simpler, something almost everyone still believes without ever questioning it. It has to do with the shape of the world itself. Picture a stone hall in the Spanish city of Salamanca sometime around 1486, torches burning low against damp walls, a council of professors and friars seated in a half circle, arms crossed unconvinced, and standing alone in front of them, a red-haired sailor from Genoa far from home holding nothing but a set of maps, a stubborn conviction, and no idea at all that history was about to remember this room completely wrong. His name, of course, was Christopher Columbus, and almost everything you were ever taught about what actually happened inside that room is not quite true. Here is the version most of us grew up with. Columbus, the brave visionary standing up to a room full of small-minded churchmen who insisted the earth was flat, who warned him he would sail his ships right off the edge of the world and drop into nothing. The lone genius against the frightened, ignorant crowd. It makes a wonderful story, it really does. It is also almost entirely invented. Let's untangle this gently, because I know it might sting a little if you grew up with the same textbook I did. By the time Columbus walked into that hall, educated people across Europe had already known the earth was round for well over 1,000 years, not suspected, not guessed at, calculated with real numbers centuries before his ships ever left the dock. Go back further still, all the way to a scholar named Eratosthenes, chief librarian of the great collection at Alexandria, working sometime around 240 years before the Common Era. Eratosthenes heard something curious, that on a certain day each year far to the south in a town called Sienne, the midday sun sat so directly overhead that it lit the bottom of a deep well without casting a single shadow. Yet on that very same day in Alexandria, a simple vertical post still threw a small measurable shadow of its own. To most people that would sound like nothing, a trick of the light maybe, but Eratosthenes could not let it go. If the earth were flat, he reasoned the sun's angle would be identical everywhere at that exact same moment. The only way to explain the gap between these two shadows was if the ground itself curved between them. So he measured the distance between the two cities. He measured the angle of the shadow, and he did the math using nothing more than stick sunlight and geometry. His final estimate for the circumference of the entire planet landed astonishingly close to the number we still use today, off by only a small margin. No satellites, no telescopes. Just a curious man trusting what the shadows were quietly telling him. That was over 1,700 years before Columbus ever set foot on a ship, and Eratosthenes was hardly the only one who kept refining that number. About 1,000 years later, while much of Europe was supposedly buried in its so-called darkness, a scholar named Al-Biruni, working in what is now Pakistan, tried an entirely different approach. Instead of measuring shadows in two distant cities, he climbed a single mountain, carefully measured the dip of the horizon from its summit, using an instrument he built himself, and calculated the Earth's circumference from that one vantage point alone. His result landed remarkably close to the modern figure achieved without ever leaving that one region. Two different scholars working centuries apart in two completely different parts of the world, using two completely different methods, kept arriving at roughly the same answer. That is not the kind of agreement that happens by superstition. That is the kind of agreement that only happens when a fact is simply quietly true. And here is the detail that tends to surprise people most. That knowledge never actually vanished. It simply kept getting passed forward quietly, generation after generation, long after Rome fell, and the world supposedly went dark. A monk named Bede, working in a cold monastery in the north of England, wrote a book around the year 725, explaining how to properly calculate the church calendar. Tucked inside it, almost as a passing fact, he explained that the earth is shaped like a ball, and that this exact shape is the reason daylight lasts longer in some regions than others, depending on how far north or south you happen to stand. He was not arguing for it. He was simply teaching it the way you might teach a child that water freezes in the cold, because monasteries across an entire continent depended on getting that calculation right. 5 centuries after Bede, a scholar named John of Sacrobosco wrote a short book called The Sphere of the World sometime around the year 1230. For roughly the next 400 years, in university after university from Paris to distant Krakow, this little book was the very first astronomy text handed to any student hoping to study the stars. Its opening pages do not flirt with the idea of a flat earth, not even for a single sentence. They open with proof after proof that the world is round, leaning on the same reasoning Aristotle had laid out more than 1,000 years before the curved shadow the earth casts across the moon, during an eclipse the way a departing ship's mast is always the very last thing to slip below the horizon, the way certain stars quietly disappear from the sky as a traveller moves farther north or south. Here's a question for you. Next time you happen to see an old painting of a king or an emperor holding a small golden ball with a cross resting on top of it, take a closer look. That little object is not a toy, and it is not decoration for its own sake. It even has its own name, the orb, and it was a small, solid model of a round planet resting quietly in the palm of nearly every monarch crowned across Europe for the better part of 1,000 years long before Columbus was even born. The kings of England still carry one at their coronation today. So did the emperors of what was once called the Holy Roman Empire centuries before anyone in Spain had ever heard the name Columbus. A round earth was not some fringe theory whispered about in back rooms. It was etched into the very symbols of royal power held up in front of entire kingdoms during their most solemn public ceremonies. So if literally every university student in Europe was handed a textbook proving the earth was round, and every crowned king stood at his own coronation, holding a tiny model of that same round earth in his hand, who exactly still needed convincing? The real disagreement inside that hall in Salamanca was never about the Earth's shape. It was about its size, specifically how far it actually was to sail west and reach Asia. Columbus believed the coast of Asia sat somewhere around 3,000 miles west of the Canary Islands. He had leaned on a shrunken, overly generous set of older estimates, stretched even further by reports from Marco Polo's travels, until the ocean in his mind became small enough to cross with the ships and supplies he actually had. The professors at Salamanca, working from older, sturdier calculations closer to Eratosthenes' original number, told him plainly that he was wrong. The real distance, they said, was much greater than that, and no ship could possibly carry enough food and fresh water to survive a crossing that long. Mathematically, they were almost entirely correct. The true distance by that route is closer to 11,000 miles, and here is a small detail worth sitting with because it quietly corrects yet another piece of the legend. Weeks into the actual crossing, Columbus's crew did grow anxious, restless, some of them close to open mutiny, but it had nothing to do with monsters or a sudden drop into nothingness at the edge of a flat sea. They were simply running out of food and fresh water, staring at an empty horizon day after day, with no land in sight, doing quiet math of their own about how many more days they could survive out there. Their fear was practical, human, entirely reasonable. Not a single log letter or journal from that voyage mentions anyone worrying about sailing off the edge of the world. Except for one detail nobody sitting in that hall had any way of knowing. An entire pair of continents happened to be sitting quietly in the middle of that ocean, exactly where Columbus expected nothing but open water for months on end. He was not proven right by a clever new theory. He was saved by pure, staggering coincidence, stumbling into land at almost the exact moment his crew was running out of food. It is one of history's stranger ironies that the man remembered for boldly proving the scholars wrong was in almost every calculation that mattered, proving them right except for the one continent-sized detail none of them could have possibly guessed at. So if nobody in that hall was actually arguing about a flat earth, where did that dramatic showdown come from? The frightened priests the scripture quoted like a threat, the warning about ships tumbling off the edge of the map. For that we have to jump forward more than 300 years to a writer named Washington Irving, settling into a desk in Madrid sometime in the 1820s. Irving is better remembered today for spookier tales the headless horseman chasing a schoolteacher through the dark, a man who dozes off for 20 years in the mountains. But an American diplomat stationed in Spain, a man named Alexander Hill Everett, had invited him to Madrid to work through a fresh collection of documents about Columbus. Irving looked over the material and decided a full biography would serve his readers better than a simple translation. So he set out to write one and published it in the year 1828. Irving was above everything else a storyteller. And when he reached the part of Columbus's life covering that meeting in Salamanca, the real notes in front of him were frankly a little dry. A committee raising careful technical objections about distance and provisions, not exactly a scene built for drama. So Irving did what storytellers do. He reached for a sharper conflict. In his retelling, the council becomes a den of monastic bigotry, hurling scripture at Columbus like weapons, warning him that his own crew might vanish over the edge of a flat and hostile earth. It reads beautifully. It also, according to historians who later went back through his own cited sources, line by line bears almost no resemblance to anything that actually happened in that room. One historian many years later spent an enormous amount of time combing through medieval writings, specifically hunting for a single respected European scholar anywhere who seriously argued the earth was flat sometime after, say, the year 1000. He came back almost completely empty-handed. The flat earth-believing Middle Ages, it turns out, were never real. They were a scene written for drama by a novelist working 3 centuries after the fact. It probably did not hurt that Irving's version of events fit so neatly into what a young ambitious country wanted to hear about itself. In the young United States of the 1820s, Columbus was already being reshaped into something closer to a homegrown folk hero, a practical self-made outsider who trusted his own instincts over the tired authority of old European institutions. A scrappy man of vision proven right against a room full of comfortable experts. That story did not just entertain readers, it quietly flattered an entire nation that liked to see itself the very same way. And once that scene existed inside a wildly popular book, other writers picked it up and ran even further with it. Later that same century, a chemist named John Draper and separately a university president named Andrew White were both building a much larger argument about religion supposedly being locked in an ancient war against science. Irving's flat earth scene fit their argument perfectly, so they folded it in as though it were settled historical fact, never mind that it had never actually happened. From there it slid quietly into textbook after textbook, decade after decade, until a fictional scene from a 19th century novel had quietly become common knowledge about an entire era of European history. Isn't that a strange thing to sit with for a moment? We live in an age where you can look almost anything up in seconds, and yet some of the facts we still repeat without a second thought were never actually checked, not even once. They were simply retold so many times that the retelling itself started to feel like proof. Maybe that is simply how memory works on a scale of centuries instead of years. A quiet, accurate detail about shipping provisions and careful geometry does not travel very far on its own. It has no villain, no danger, nothing to picture in your mind at 3 a.m. But hand people a vivid scene, frightened monks quoting scripture at a lone sailor standing on the edge of doom, and suddenly the story has legs of its own. It does not need to be true to spread. It only needs to be memorable. I am curious, honestly. What is something you were completely certain of for years, something you would have argued about at a dinner table, before you found out it was never quite true? Tell me down in the comments. I promise you are not the only one. In a strange way, Washington Irving did in 1828 almost exactly what a viral post does today. He took something mostly true, added one vivid invented detail because the truth alone felt a little flat, no pun intended, and let it travel so far and so fast that the invented part eventually outran the truth completely. So nobody standing in that hall in the late 1480s thought Columbus would sail his ships off the edge of a flat, doomed world. The shape of the earth was never seriously in question, not by anyone with an education not for over 1,000 years before he was even born. What was actually in question was simply how big that sphere turned out to be, and what quiet, uncounted pieces of it were still waiting out there to be found. And once you start pulling on a thread like this one, you start noticing how many more of them are hanging loose all through this same story. Because the next lie waiting for us has nothing to do with maps, oceans, or the shape of a planet at all. It sits much closer to the skin, almost literally. It has to do with the water, the soap, and the surprisingly clean truth, hiding underneath one of the dirtiest reputations in all of history. Long before sunrise in cities all across medieval Europe, a very particular sound used to roll down the narrow streets, and it had nothing to do with church bells or roosters. It was a voice. A crier walking the lanes of a city like Paris while most people were still half asleep, calling out the exact same message morning after morning. The baths are hot. Come and get washed. A scholar named Alexander Neckham, who made his home in that same city, wrote about being woken by that exact cry, drifting up through his window before dawn, over and over until it simply became part of the rhythm of the city itself, as ordinary as birdsong. Picture the scene for a moment, because it makes a beautiful opening shot if you ever put a camera on it. Narrow stone streets still dark, shutters creaking open one by one, steam already curling out from under a wooden door down the lane where a fire has been burning under a row of tubs since well before sunrise, waiting for the first customers of the day. Think about that for a second. An entire profession existed in what we still like to call the dirtiest, most backward stretch of European history, built entirely around waking people up to go take a bath. It was basically a medieval push notification minus the phone. Can you imagine setting an alarm for 8 in the morning, and instead of a chime you get a grown man outside your window, personally announcing that the water is ready? I bring this up because if you grew up anywhere near a Western classroom, you were probably handed a very specific picture of medieval people. Grimy, unwashed, terrified of water somehow for nearly 1,000 years straight, as though an entire continent collectively decided that soap was optional and showers were for cowards. It is such a common image that most of us never stop to question it. So let's actually look at the numbers, because they tell a very different story. By the 1200s, the city of Paris alone was home to more than 30 public bathhouses. Not 30 over the course of several centuries. 30 running at once in a single city, each one heated, staffed and open for business most days of the week. Running one of these places took real labour. Someone had to haul water from the river, or a nearby well heat enormous cauldrons of it over a constant fire, and keep that fire burning through most of the daylight hours. The workers themselves often did double duty as barbers, offering a shaver haircut or even minor medical treatments like bloodletting, while customers soaked, which is part of why even centuries later the barber and the surgeon still shared a strange tangled professional history in parts of Europe. In the year 1268, the provost of Paris, a man named Etienne Boileau, compiled an enormous book of trade regulations covering roughly 130 different professions in the city. Bathhouse keeper was one of them, listed right alongside bakers, butchers and tailors, complete with its own set of official rules. They were not permitted to heat their baths on Sunday, or on the major feast days the city observed. That is not the kind of detail you write down for an activity nobody cares about. You write it down because the activity is common enough and profitable enough that someone in charge feels the need to regulate it. And bathing was not confined to those public houses either. Soap itself was already a working industry across medieval Europe, not some forgotten Roman secret waiting to be rediscovered centuries later. Soap makers were operating in Spain as early as the 8th century. France had its own thriving soap trade by the 13th century, centered around the Mediterranean coast using local olive oil, the very beginning of what would eventually become the famous soap of Marseille. England had followed with its own soap makers by the 14th century. This was not a luxury smuggled in from some brighter civilization elsewhere. It was a local, everyday craft passed down through workshops, the same way bread-making or woodworking was. Even the people we most associate with a strict self-denying life were not exempt from this. Monasteries followed rules written by their founders centuries earlier, and those rules openly allowed for bathing, particularly for anyone sick or unwell, with larger monasteries often building their own dedicated bathing rooms entirely separate from the kitchens, sometimes fed by their own small stream, diverted specifically for that purpose. The popular image of a monk scorning water as a point of spiritual pride simply is not supported by the buildings monasteries actually built for themselves brick by brick with their own hands and their own money. And this was not only a city habit either. Household account books that survive from wealthy medieval families are dotted with small, unremarkable purchases, soap-scented herbs to sweeten the bath water, and fees paid to the local bathhouse recorded in exactly the same flat routine tone you would use for flour or firewood. Nobody sits down to carefully log a payment for something considered strange or shameful. You log it the same way you log anything else you buy without a second thought. Step inside almost any medieval household, wealthy or humble, and you would find another small ritual that rarely makes it into the movies. Before a meal began, someone brought around a basin of water and a cloth, and every single person at that table washed their hands, guests included, as a simple matter of manners. Doing otherwise was not just unhygienic, it was rude. Some households owned decorated metal jugs made specifically for this one purpose, poured out over the hands before anyone touched the food. People cleaned their teeth with small cloths and tooth powders. They combed and picked through each other's hair for lice, which sounds unpleasant to us now, but was at the time a completely ordinary, almost social activity, the kind of thing you might do while catching up with a sister or a dear friend. None of this fits the version of medieval life most of us absorbed without ever really examining it. And here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. Where do you think that grimy, unwashed image actually came from if the real evidence points so clearly in the other direction? Step inside one of those 30 bathhouses on a busy afternoon, and you would find something closer to a neighborhood social club than a quick functional errand. Large wooden tubs, sometimes shared by 2 or 3 people at once, arranged around a steaming central room, the water often scented with lavender chamomile or rose petals to cover the smell of the smoke outside. A server moving between them, offering bread, wine, or a hot meal, because a good soak could easily stretch into an hour or more. Someone playing music in the corner, a game board balanced across the edge of a tub while 2 men argued cheerfully over their next move. Men and women often bathed in the same space together, which unsurprisingly made these houses just as popular for flirtation and gossip as they were for actually getting clean. This was not a grim obligatory chore squeezed into a hard life. For a great many medieval people, bath day was something closer to a favourite weekly outing, the kind of plan you looked forward to all week. Does that sound anything like the shivering, grimy peasants most history documentaries still like to show you? The honest answer involves neither ignorance nor apathy. It involves a disease, and the timing of it might actually catch you off guard. In the year 1495, a French king named Charles VIII marched an army into Naples, chasing a claim to the throne he believed was rightfully his. His campaign fell apart within months, and his soldiers scattered back across the continent, carrying home something far more permanent than defeat. Doctors travelling with that army began noticing strange painful sores spreading among the men sores that no physician alive had ever been trained to recognize or treat. Nobody had a name for it yet. Nobody understood how it spread or why it seemed to move so quickly from town to town in the soldiers' wake. Within a handful of years, it had a name in nearly every language in Europe, usually borrowed from whichever neighbouring country people preferred to blame. The French called it the disease of Naples. The Italians called it the French disease. Whatever they called it, everyone agreed on one thing: it was terrifying, it was new, and it seemed to spread fastest in exactly the kind of warm, crowded skin-to-skin gathering a public bathhouse was built around. We know it today as syphilis. Within only a few years, the disease had reportedly reached as far as England, Scotland, and Russia, riding along ordinary trade routes and army movements with a speed that stunned physicians who had never tracked an epidemic moving quite that fast before. Doctors of that era did not fully understand disease the way we understand it now, but they were paying careful attention to patterns, and what they saw frightened them badly. Some physicians were already working from far older medical theories about the body ones that treated the skin as a kind of gate rather than a barrier. Heat in their thinking opened the pores wide, and once opened those same pores, let in corrupted, poisoned air along with the steam. Health guides written for wealthy households, the kind of practical little manuals people kept on a shelf and consulted the way we might check a website today, had already begun, quietly warning readers to be careful around hot water, decades before syphilis ever entered the picture. Layer a new, visibly horrifying disease on top of an existing medical fear about steam and open pores, and bathhouses stopped looking like places of comfort almost overnight. They started looking like places of danger. Within a single generation, an entire social institution collapsed. The Dutch scholar Erasmus, writing in the 1520s, looked back on his own lifetime and described exactly this shift. He recalled that only 25 years earlier, public bathhouses in his own region had been the most fashionable, most popular gathering spot around. And now he said there were none left standing because a frightening new sickness had taught an entire generation to simply stay away from shared water and crowded steaming rooms. That is not a vague cultural drift happening over centuries. That is a documented living memory describing a complete collapse inside 25 years, told by a man old enough to remember exactly what had been lost. People did not, of course, stop washing altogether the moment the bathhouses shut their doors. They simply moved that washing behind their own front doors into private basins and smaller tubs, kept at home away from the crowded public halls that had so suddenly come to feel unsafe. Bathing became quieter, smaller and far more private a household matter instead of a neighbourhood one. And it is precisely that, quieter, more private, more cautious version of hygiene, born out of very real fear, rather than any lack of care that later generations mistook for proof that medieval people had never bothered washing at all. Here is the part that I find almost a little unfair if we're being honest about it. That later shift, that private, cautious, disease-driven retreat from public bathing, happening at the very end of the medieval world and stretching into the centuries afterward, is exactly the image later writers grabbed onto when they wanted to paint the entire Middle Ages as one long unbroken smear of filth. Writers living centuries after the fact, looking back with their own comfortable modern plumbing, needed a dark backdrop to make their own age look brighter by comparison. So they reached for the grimiest slice of the story they could find, the frightened water, avoiding decades that came directly after the medieval world had technically ended, stretched it backward across 1,000 years it never actually belonged to, and left out the criers, the guild regulations, the soap makers, and the 30 bathhouses of Paris entirely. It is a little like judging an entire marriage by the argument that finally ended it, and never once mentioning the years that came before. I do not think that is a coincidence, honestly. It fits a pattern we keep running into again and again in this story. Someone standing at a comfortable distance in a later century needed the past to look worse than it was, simply to make their own moment feel like an improvement. It is the same instinct behind every generation that insists the music, the manners, or the weather were somehow better back in their day, except run in reverse backward onto people who never got a chance to argue back. Have you ever noticed that in your own life, how the easiest way to feel proud of where you've arrived is to quietly exaggerate how bad things used to be back when you started? So the next time somebody jokes about medieval people never bathing you, now know the far stranger, far more human truth sitting underneath that joke. For most of the medieval period, Europeans were washing socially publicly, and often in heated public halls advertised each morning by a man walking the streets and shouting the good news at the top of his lungs. It was not ignorance that eventually pushed that world behind closed doors. It was fear and grief, and a disease nobody had a name for yet. And once you start noticing how often fear gets mistaken for ignorance in stories like this one, you start wondering what else got quietly misfiled the same way, tucked into the wrong drawer of history and never taken back out to be checked. Because there is one number from this exact era that gets repeated more often than almost any other fact about the Middle Ages, tossed around so casually at dinner tables and in classrooms alike, that nobody ever stops to ask where it actually came from or whether it even means what we think it means. It is a number about how long people back then were supposed to have survived. A number that sounds simple, almost too simple, right up until you actually sit down and do the math behind it yourself. And it turns out that number is telling you something almost entirely different than what you've always assumed. Here is a number that gets repeated so often at dinner tables, in classrooms, in 100 different documentaries that almost nobody ever stops to ask a very simple question about it. What does it actually mean? 30. That is the number you've probably heard a dozen times. The average medieval person, we're told, died around 30 years old, and most of us quietly translate that into a picture in our heads, a world where 40 was ancient, where a person your age right now would already be considered a fragile elder, propped up by a cane and treated like a walking miracle just for still being upright. Here is the strange part. That number 30 is not actually wrong. Historians really did calculate something not far from it. The mistake is not in the math. The mistake is in what we assumed the math was telling us. Let's slow down and actually build an average together the same way a historian would. Picture 5 people from a single medieval village. One, a baby girl, dies before her first birthday. A second, a boy of about 6, dies from a fever. Nobody back then had a name for the kind that swept through a household in a single bad week. A third survives. All of that danger grows up, marries, raises a family of her own, and eventually dies at 68. A fourth lives to 71, still tending his own small patch of land almost to the end. And a fifth, tougher or simply luckier than the rest, makes it all the way to 79, remembered by the whole village as the old woman who had outlived 3 different priests. Add those 5 ages together, divide by 5, and what do you get? Somewhere in the low 40s. Now imagine a village where even more children did not survive their earliest years, which was tragically common, and that average drops even further, sliding down toward 30, exactly the number you've heard so often. Notice something important though. Not one single person in that example actually died at 40 or at 30. 2 of them died as children. 3 of them enjoyed long, full lives well into old age. The average is real. It is also describing a situation that never happened to a single individual person in that village. That in a nutshell is the whole trick sitting underneath this myth. Life expectancy at birth is an average pulled across an entire population, and averages get pulled hardest by the numbers sitting at the extremes. In a world where a devastating share of children, by some estimates nearing a third or more, did not survive past their earliest years, that tragedy alone drags the overall number down into the 30s, even while plenty of people around them were quietly living into their 60s, 70s and beyond. I want to be careful here because I do not want to swing too far the other way, and pretend medieval adulthood was somehow secretly easy once you cleared childhood. It was not. Death did not politely step aside the moment a person turned 18. Women faced very real danger with every single childbirth, a risk that followed them through most of their adult years, not only their first pregnancy. A fever, an infected wound, or a bad harvest could still take a person at 35 or 45 without much warning, and outbreaks of plague reached into every decade of life, not only the earliest ones sweeping through entire villages, regardless of how many summers a person had already survived. So when I tell you that a great many people went on to enjoy long, full lives, I do not mean that the world was gentle. I mean that survival, when it happened, tended to stretch out far longer than the popular 30-year figure would ever suggest. This is not a story about medieval people secretly enjoying modern lifespans in disguise. It is a story about the difference between a population-wide average and one individual person's realistic future, and those two things are simply not the same question, even though we keep answering them as if they were. Here is something worth sitting with for a second. If 2 out of every 10 people you personally knew had died before the age of 5, and everyone else you knew went on to have a full ordinary life into their 70s, what number do you think a historian 1,000 years from now would calculate as your generation's typical lifespan? It would look shockingly low on paper, and it still would not remotely describe what your own life or your grandmother's life actually looked like from the inside. We're honestly not as far removed from this kind of confusion as we like to think. Open almost any news story today about the average salary in a given city, and you will usually find one line buried near the bottom, admitting that a handful of extremely wealthy residents are quietly dragging that whole number upward, making the typical person's paycheck look far higher than what most people in that city actually take home. Same trick, opposite direction. An average is only ever honest when you also ask who specifically is sitting at each end of it, pulling the middle number toward them. Historians studying the medieval world simply learned that lesson a little sooner than the rest of us tend to. So if the real picture is this much more hopeful than the cartoon version, how do historians actually know that? It is not guesswork. It comes from an enormous patient body of record, keeping most of it produced by people who had absolutely no idea they were quietly building a statistical rebuttal that would matter 700 years later. In medieval England, whenever a landholder died, the Crown ordered an official inquiry to determine exactly who would inherit that land, and crucially how old the heir currently was. These inquiries, gathered county by county across centuries, piled up into an enormous archive that ended up quietly preserving thousands of specific dated human lifespans, almost entirely by accident as a side effect of paperwork about property. Separately, many monasteries kept their own careful death registers recording the exact day a monk had died, sometimes decades after he'd first entered as a young adult in his 20s. Historians combing back through both of these very different sources, land inheritance rolls on one side and monastery death registers on the other, kept landing on the same striking pattern. Anyone who survived past their 20s had a real well-documented chance of seeing 60, seeing 70, sometimes considerably more. And once you start looking for actual individual examples instead of averages, they are honestly not hard to find. The wider culture itself was clearly planning for old age too, not treating it as some rare miracle. Manorial court records from medieval England regularly include arrangements for elderly tenants who could no longer manage heavy field work, excusing them from certain labour duties or shifting them toward lighter tasks appropriate to their years. Guild rules in some towns set aside support for members who had grown too old to continue their trade, effectively an early form of retirement. None of that makes sense in a world where reaching 60 or 70 was some kind of freak accident. You do not write formal legal provisions for a situation that almost never happens. You write them because everyone around you expects reasonably to eventually need them. Now it is only fair to admit something here because good history should always show you its own limits. Most of the specific dated records historians can point to, those land inheritance rolls and monastery registers, tend to come from nobles' knights and monks simply because those were the people whose lives got written down at all. Ordinary peasants rarely appear in that kind of paperwork by name, but archaeologists have another way of checking the picture, one that does not care about class or title at all the skeletons themselves. Digging through medieval cemeteries, bioarchaeologists regularly find skeletons showing every hallmark of genuine old age, worn joints, healed and reset bones from injuries, decades-old teeth ground down over a lifetime of hard bread and grit. Old age, in other words, was not some rare privilege reserved for the wealthy few whose names happen to survive in a ledger. The ground itself backs up the paperwork. Take a young knight barely out of his teenage years escorting a convoy through the French countryside in the late 1160s as part of the household guard for one of the most powerful women in all of Europe. The convoy was ambushed on the road. His own uncle was killed defending it. The young knight himself was wounded badly enough in the leg to be dragged off and held for ransom by his captors. The woman he'd been protecting, rather than simply moving on without him, personally arranged and paid that ransom herself. That woman was Eleanor of Aquitaine, and this one quiet act of loyalty toward an injured young guard would end up shaping the next 50 years of English history in ways nobody standing on that road could have possibly guessed. Eleanor herself is worth pausing on for a moment because her own life quietly demolishes the 30-year myth all on its own, no statistics required. Born around 1122, married to the King of France, while barely more than a girl, later Queen of England as well, mother to 2 future kings imprisoned by her own husband for roughly 15 years after backing a rebellion against him. And still, after all of that, she rode out from that imprisonment to personally govern territory and negotiate alliances well into old age. At nearly 80 years old, she crossed the Pyrenees mountains herself on horseback in the middle of winter to personally select and collect a granddaughter from the Spanish court and bring her home to marry into the French royal family. Along the way, one of her own vassals actually ambushed the convoy and tried to kidnap her, holding her briefly, in hopes of extracting a valuable piece of territory as the price of her release. Eleanor, by every account entirely unbothered by the inconvenience, simply agreed to his demand, secured her own freedom within days, and calmly continued on towards Spain, as though the whole episode had barely interrupted her schedule. She died in the spring of 1204 inside the walls of an abbey she had chosen for herself at the age of 82, and the young knight she once ransomed did not fade quietly into old age either. His name was William Marshall, and nearly 50 years after that roadside ambush in the year 1217, England found itself fighting for its own survival against a French invasion backed by rebellious barons. Royal advisers gathered around the young king arguing over strategy, while the actual man chosen to personally command the army to ride at the very front of the charge himself, with the sword still in his hand, was William Marshall. He was 70 years old at the time, and according to the biography written soon after his death by men who had known him personally, he was so eager to reach the fighting That young squire had to physically remind him to put his helmet on before the charge began. He won, decisively. He continued governing the kingdom as regent for another 2 years afterward, before dying peacefully in his own bed surrounded by his family in the spring of 1219. Sit with that for a moment. A man in his 70s personally leading a cavalry charge that decided the fate of an entire kingdom. Try picturing that the next time somebody jokes that people back then were washed up and ancient by 30. Have you ever wondered what your own grandparents were doing at 70? Now imagine one of them buckling on armour and riding into the front line of a battlefield instead of a garden. There is something almost funny about how thoroughly we have gotten this backward. We picture medieval people creaking around like they were constantly one bad cough away from the grave, when the honest historical record is full of grandmothers negotiating royal marriages on horseback and grandfathers leading armies into their 70s. Meanwhile, plenty of us today treat turning 30 as some kind of quiet personal tragedy, complete with dramatic birthday cards about fading youth and dark jokes about hearing our own knees creak. The people who actually spent their lives in the 12th and 13th centuries would probably find that whole modern anxiety a little hilarious. I think part of why this particular myth has survived so well is that it flatters us in a quiet, almost invisible way. If we believe people back then barely made it past 30, our own long lives start to feel like a personal triumph proof of exactly how far we have come. It is a satisfying story to tell ourselves. It is just not a very accurate one. The real story is a little less flattering to us, and honestly a little more moving. It is not about how far humanity has climbed away from some brutal, short, fleeting past. It is about how much resilience and love and quiet, stubborn survival was already sitting there the whole time, buried under one badly misunderstood number. Maybe that is worth remembering the next time you catch yourself dreading a birthday, or joking about being over the hill at an age that would have made a certain 70-year-old regent laugh out loud while sharpening his sword. And it turns out uncovering that real story required exactly the kind of patient, careful record-keeping that people rarely give the medieval world any credit for at all. Not dramatic, not glamorous, just some quiet person in a cold room year after year writing one more name and one more date into a book nobody outside those walls would ever think to open. Because if a handful of monks quietly writing death dates into the back pages of a monastery register could end up correcting a myth believed by millions of people 1,000 years later, that raises an obvious question worth carrying forward with us into the rest of this story. What else were those same quiet monks writing down, copying and protecting all those centuries ago while the rest of the world simply assumed nobody up there was paying any attention at all? Let's actually go find out, because the honest answer to that question refuses to sit still in one century, one country, or even one single kind of person. It moves through a retired politician, a foreign scholar hired to fix bad handwriting, and a nun with a grudge against a dead Roman playwright, none of whom ever met each other, and none of whom had any idea they were quietly working on the same rescue mission. It starts of all places with a tired Roman politician deciding to quit his job. His name was Cassiodorus, and for most of his career he had done exactly what a smart, well-connected Roman was supposed to do in a collapsing world. He served in government, rising all the way to one of the highest administrative posts in the land. He worked closely with the Ostrogothic king who now ruled Italy in place of any actual Roman emperor, since there had not been one in the West for decades. He watched from about as near as a person could stand while the machinery of Roman government slowly ground down to almost nothing. Armies marched back and forth across Italy. Old buildings went unrepaired. The kind of careful, literate administration his whole career had depended on was quietly falling apart around him, one badly copied document, one abandoned office, one broken supply line at a time. Most people in his position would have written a bitter letter about it and left it at that. Cassiodorus did something else entirely. It helps to picture just how much labour a single finished book actually demanded back then, because it puts the whole idea of a scriptorium into proper perspective. There was no paper yet, not in the West. Every page began as animal skin carefully scraped, stretched and dried into something called vellum. A single large volume, sometimes requiring the hides of more than 100 animals before a single word was ever written on it. Ink had to be mixed by hand, often from crushed oak galls and iron, and a single skilled monk copying steadily hour after hour, day after day, might still need the better part of a full year to finish one substantial book. Every single copy of every surviving classical text you've ever heard mentioned in a documentary at some point passed through hands doing exactly that. Sometime in his later years he walked away from politics completely and used his own money to build something strange and specific in the hills of southern Italy, near a quiet stretch of coastline in a region called Calabria. A monastery, yes, but one built around a very particular kind of room, a scriptorium, a dedicated copying room fitted out with a sundial to track the hours, a water clock for cloudy days, and most charming of all, a lamp cleverly designed to refill itself with oil from a hidden reservoir so the monks working inside would never have to stop and lose their place just to keep the light burning. He even gave the whole property a name that had nothing to do with grim religious severity at all. He called it vivarium after the fish ponds dotting the grounds, a word closer in spirit to a nature reserve than a fortress of solemn discipline. He did not build this room to store treasure or grain or weapons. He built it to copy books, all kinds of books, not only scripture but Cicero and the old Roman poets and works of Greek philosophy, treated as worth the same careful ink and the same patient hours as anything sacred. He even sat down and wrote an entire instruction manual for his monks, a text he called, roughly translated, Principles of Sacred and Secular Learning. It walked them through exactly how to correct a damaged manuscript, how to repair torn pages, how to check a fresh copy against the original line by line for careless errors, before it was ever allowed to leave the room. It even included something like a recommended reading list steering his monks toward the best available texts on grammar, history and rhetoric, right alongside guidance on scripture. Reading it now feels almost startlingly modern, less like ancient religious ritual and more like a very detailed employee handbook for the world's first quiet little publishing house. Here is the part I keep coming back to honestly. Centuries later, we spent an entire earlier chapter of this story on a poet named Petrarch, weeping in the ruins of Rome, grieving for a civilization he believed had already been lost for good. Cassiodorus was actually there. He watched the real collapse happen with his own eyes in real time, standing right in the middle of it, with nobody to romanticize it from a safe distance. And his response was not grief. It was action. Bricks, ink and a lamp that refused to go out. He was not even alone in that instinct. Cassiodorus openly admired a fellow monk of that same rough era named Dionysius Exiguus, the very man credited with inventing the dating system that counts years forward from the birth of Christ, the same basic counting method still printed at the top of your own calendar today. One monk quietly invented the way we count years. Another quietly saved the books that explained what those years had meant. Neither of them knew the other's work would still matter 1,500 years later. If you squint at it the right way, Cassiodorus basically built the world's first backup server, except instead of a data center humming with machines, it was a stone room, a handful of monks and one very stubborn lamp that refused to run out of oil. Have you ever backed up your own photos to the cloud just in case your phone suddenly breaks? Now imagine doing that with the entire surviving memory of Roman civilization, using nothing but ink, patience and candlelight. Now fast forward roughly 250 years to a much bigger, much louder problem. By the time Charlemagne had assembled a genuine empire stretching across much of Western Europe, he ran into an issue that had nothing to do with armies or borders at all. His scribes scattered across dozens of monasteries in dozens of regions were all writing in wildly different, often sloppy versions of Latin script, riddled with regional shortcuts, cramped abbreviations and inconsistent letter forms that could look almost unrecognizable from one monastery to the next. Copy a document through 2 or 3 of these mismatched hands, and small errors compounded fast a garbled letter. Here a dropped word there, until entire texts risked slowly corrupting themselves into nonsense, one careless copy at a time. Charlemagne, by most accounts, a man who could barely write his own name fluently, despite ruling half a continent, cared enormously about getting this right, both for governing his sprawling territory and for making sure sacred texts were not slowly being mangled through generations of sloppy transcription. So he did something wonderfully practical about it. He recruited an English scholar named Alcuin of York, brought him to run the palace school at Aachen, and set him loose on the problem. Alcuin and the scribes working under him developed a clean, rounded, wonderfully legible new handwriting style with clear spacing between words, real lowercase letters and sensible punctuation, all specifically engineered to be easy to write quickly and nearly impossible to mistake for something else. Alcuin later retired to become abbot of a monastery in the city of Tours, where he built up one of the busiest scriptoriums in the entire empire, churning out carefully corrected copies of the Bible and countless other texts using this exact new style. Monasteries across the empire adopted it. Historians today can still count more than 7,000 surviving manuscripts written in this exact style from just those 2 centuries alone, and a truly enormous share of everything we currently know about classical Latin literature exists only because it happened to get copied down using it. Here is a question worth sitting with. Have you ever actually looked closely at the lowercase letters sitting right in front of you on a screen or a page? The gentle curves, the clear spacing, the easy legibility you have never once had to think about. You are looking at a very distant descendant of exactly that script, an idea originally engineered to solve one emperor's headache over messy handwriting. And here comes my favourite twist in this entire story, the one that always makes me laugh a little when I think about it too hard. Roughly 600 years later, Renaissance scholars in Italy went hunting through old monastery libraries, specifically searching for pure, authentic, ancient Roman writing, hoping to revive it after what they insisted on calling their own dark backward centuries. And when they found stacks of manuscripts written in this clean, elegant, wonderfully legible script, they were thrilled. They assumed they had finally struck gold, real Roman handwriting at last, untouched by centuries of supposed decline. So they copied it, admired it, and built their whole new printing typefaces directly on top of it, these same basic letter forms that eventually became the foundation for the printed page as we still know it today, the same rounded, friendly shape sitting quietly in the font on your own screen right now, except it was never actually ancient Roman handwriting at all. It was Alcuin's handwriting. It was a Dark Ages invention dreamed up by monks solving a practical filing problem that the so-called Age of Enlightenment mistook for the glow of ancient Rome itself and copied without ever realizing whose light they were actually borrowing. Try holding on to that the next time somebody insists nothing of value came out of these centuries. Let me introduce you to one more name, because this next one deserves far more attention than she usually gets. Her convent in the town of Gandersheim in what is now northern Germany was not some remote powerless backwater either. It answered directly to distant church authority, rather than any local lord minted its own coins, and held enough independent standing that its abbess effectively governed a small territory in her own right. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of setting where a sharp, well-educated woman might actually get the room to do something unusual. Roughly a century after Alcuin's script had spread across Europe, a canoness at that convent named Hrotsvita sat down with a stack of old Roman comedies written by a playwright named Terence and found herself deeply annoyed. Terence wrote clever, witty plays, but his women tended to be shallow, foolish, or simply background scenery for the men's stories. Hrotsvita decided she could do better, and so quietly in Latin inside the walls of her own convent, she became the first person we know of anywhere in Western Europe to write actual stage drama since the fall of Rome itself roughly 500 years earlier. She wrote 6 full plays along with a handful of legends and historical poems, all in careful, deliberate Latin. Her heroines were sharp, brave, and morally unshakable, often outwitting the powerful men around them, rather than simply suffering at their hands. She was quite literally rewriting one of Rome's own most celebrated writers from the inside, correcting him on her own terms, in a century most of us were taught to imagine as almost entirely silent. Her work then sat largely forgotten for roughly 500 years, until a German scholar rediscovered her manuscripts tucked away in a monastery library, and realized with some astonishment exactly what he was holding. Doesn't it feel a little strange, realizing that one of history's very first named female playwrights was working undisturbed and largely unknown inside the exact stretch of centuries we still casually call the darkest in European history? If someone asked you right now to name a single female writer from this era, would her name have come to mind at all? Or is this the first time you've ever heard it? 3 people, 3 completely different centuries, a retired Roman statesman with a self-refilling lamp, a foreign scholar solving a handwriting crisis for an emperor who could barely hold a pen himself, a quiet, sharp-witted nun rewriting Roman comedy on her own terms in a convent most of Europe never gave a second thought to. None of them ever met. None of them had any idea the others existed, let alone that historians 1,000 years later would eventually stitch their separate, unglamorous efforts together into proof that the lights in fact had never actually gone out at all. I think that is honestly the part that gets me the most. These were not famous people performing for an audience hoping to be remembered. They were doing quiet, unglamorous, repetitive work, 1 page, 1 letter, form, 1 careful correction at a time, with absolutely no guarantee anyone would ever notice or care. A statesman who traded political power for an oil lamp, a foreign scholar hired to fix bad handwriting, a nun rewriting a dead playwright out of sheer stubborn annoyance. None of them set out to rescue civilization. They were just doing the next right small patient thing in front of them. And yet here we are 1,000 years later, still reading the very words they chose to save in letters, shaped by the very hand they chose to invent. It is almost funny, honestly, when you put it side by side with everything else we've uncovered together in this story so far. The myths we keep believing usually trace back to someone loud, a heartbroken poet, a dramatic novelist, a costume designer chasing a good look for the stage. The truth more often than not was sitting quietly the entire time in the back room, doing the unglamorous work nobody was watching, refusing to let the light go out, simply because nobody had asked it to keep burning. And that contrast is about to become impossible to ignore because the very next story we are stepping into could not sit any further from a quiet monk with an ink pot. It involves a stage, a costume designer under pressure, and one single artistic decision made in a matter of hours that somehow convinced the entire world an ancient people looked a certain way, even though not one single piece of actual evidence ever agreed with him. Picture a cramped costume workshop backstage at an opera house in Bayreuth, Germany, in the summer of 1876, hours before the very first complete performance of Richard Wagner's 4-part opera cycle, about Norse gods and doomed heroes. The whole production had already stretched years past its original schedule, swallowing an almost absurd amount of money along the way. Fabric scraps littered every table. Singers wandered in and out for fittings, tired and short-tempered after weeks of rehearsal. And one exhausted costume designer named Carl Emil Doppler still had a minor character to dress a rough, brutish husband named Hunding, who needed to look dangerous and ancient the moment he stepped into the light with only a candle's worth of time left before the curtain rose. Doppler did not have time for careful research into actual Viking Age burial finds, mostly because almost none had even been discovered yet. What he had was a deadline, a sketchbook, and a strong visual instinct. So he reached for something simple and dramatic, a pair of curved horns fixed to the top of a plain metal helmet. He gave the female Valkyries a matching flourish, broad wings mounted on their headgear for exactly the same reason. It looked striking under stage lighting. It was easy to make out from the cheap seats at the back of the hall. That is the entire explanation. Not a discovery, not a text. Just one tired artist under pressure chasing a strong silhouette. Within a few years, that costume had crossed an ocean. When Wagner's Full Cycle premiered in New York in the late 1880s, American audiences saw the same horned-winged imagery, and it stuck there too. Illustrated storybooks borrowed it. Postcards borrowed it. A wave of nationalist artists across Germany eager to invent a suitably fierce and ancient-looking ancestor for their own modern identity borrowed it as well, painting proud, muscular warriors in horned headgear, standing in for an entire imagined ethnic past, and kept borrowing it for the better part of the next 50 years. By the time the 20th century got around to cartoons' football helmets and Halloween costume racks, nobody making those decisions was thinking about opera at all. They were simply copying the last version they had seen the same way we all do, without noticing one generation quietly inheriting another generation's shortcut, until a plastic novelty helmet sold at a costume shop can trace its entire family tree back to one stressed-out designer's late-night sketch. Here's a question worth turning over in your mind for a second. If a friend asked you right now to sketch what a Viking looked like, would horns show up on the page without you even consciously deciding to put them there? For most of us, the honest answer is yes. Think about how many football teams, cartoon mascots, and cheap party store costumes are still quietly running on that exact same 19th century opera sketch, more than a full century after the man who drew it first put down his pencil. That is exactly how thoroughly one overworked backstage decision managed to outrun every scrap of actual physical evidence for well over a century. And the physical evidence, once you actually go looking for it, tells a completely different, far more human story. For decades, archaeologists searching burial sites across Scandinavia had found plenty of Viking-age swords, axes, jewellery and combs, but never a single complete helmet. Then, in the spring of 1943, in the middle of the German military occupation of Norway, a young man named Gunnar Gjermundbo was quietly digging on his family's farm, trying to level out a patch of ground for a small retirement home he hoped to build for his aging parents. It was on paper about as ordinary and unglamorous a task as a person could set for themselves. During wartime, a bit of practical family business squeezed in between food shortages and curfews. His shovel struck something that was clearly not a rock. Underneath a low overgrown mound sat a stone burial chamber nobody alive had known was there. Word reached a local historian, then the museum in Oslo, and archaeologists arrived under difficult wartime conditions to carefully open what turned out to be the grave of an extremely wealthy Viking-age warrior, one who owned fine weapons, riding gear, and a full coat of chain mail woven from over 1,000 individual iron rings itself, the product of many long months of careful smithing. and nestled among all of that in 9 broken, corroded pieces sat the remains of an iron helmet. Once painstakingly reassembled by museum conservators piece by piece, it became and still remains today the single most complete helmet from the entire Viking Age ever recovered, one of the clearest windows we have into what real protective gear actually looked like. It has a rounded iron cap, a simple guard curving down to protect the nose and eyes. No horns, no wings, nothing decorative at all really, beyond the quiet elegance of good, honest, practical craftsmanship, built by someone who expected it to stop a real blade rather than impress an audience from a distance. There is something almost unbearably poignant about the timing of that discovery if you sit with it for a moment. Norway at that exact moment was an occupied country, its flag banned in public, its own recent history being rewritten by an invading power, eager to claim the Old Norse world as evidence for its own twisted ideas about ancestry and blood. And into exactly that atmosphere, a Norwegian farmer digging into his own family's land, simply hoping to build his parents a home, accidentally unearthed the single clearest, most honest piece of physical proof anyone had ever found about what his own distant ancestors actually looked like heading into battle. Not a myth borrowed from a German opera stage, ironically enough, at the very moment German propaganda was trying hardest to claim that exact ancestry for itself. His own soil quietly holding the truth the entire time, waiting patiently for someone with a shovel, and no idea what he was about to find. And when you stop to think about it, practically horns never made any battlefield sense in the first place. Consider what a helmet is actually for. It needs to protect your skull and deflect a blow as smoothly and predictably as possible. Bolt 2 rigid horns onto the sides, and you have built yourself a pair of convenient handles for any opponent standing near enough to grab and twist your head sideways in the middle of a fight. You have added extra weight exactly where you least want it. You've given a sword or an axe something new to catch on, besides your actual skull, and you have made it considerably harder to climb through the low doorway of your own ship without knocking yourself half unconscious on the frame. Real Viking Age helmets. The handful that have ever turned up are consistently rounded practical, and about as far from decorative as armour can get built by people who cared far more about walking home alive than about looking dramatic on the way there. Now, horned helmets did once actually exist in Scandinavia. That part is not the myth. The confusion is entirely about timing. Archaeologists have recovered a small number of ornate bronze helmets, complete with tall, curving horns, from bogs in Denmark in a find generally known today as the Vexor helmets. Those helmets are real. They are simply not Viking. They date back to the Bronze Age, somewhere in the general range of 1,000 years before the Viking Age had even begun, worn not into combat, but almost certainly for religious ceremony, the kind of ritual object you might parade rather than fight in. By the time actual Vikings were sailing anywhere, those bronze-horned helmets had already been buried in the ground, quietly rusting for longer than the entire distance separating us today from the Viking Age itself. 19th century artist working from scraps of half-understood archaeology and a strong appetite for drama, simply reached across 1,000 years of empty space and grabbed the wrong century's headgear, the way you might accidentally borrow your grandfather's coat while getting dressed for your grandson's wedding. So if the horns were never real, what were actual Viking Age people spending most of their time doing? Here is the detail that tends to surprise people the most. The word Viking in its original Norse sense was closer to a verb than an identity. To go a Viking meant to go raiding a specific temporary activity, not a permanent label stamped onto an entire people for life. A farmer might spend one restless summer raiding along a foreign coastline, then return home for the rest of his life to plant barley men fences and never leave his own valley again. Most of the population we now casually call Vikings spent the overwhelming majority of their time doing something far less cinematic. Farming, thin rocky soil, raising livestock, fishing, weaving cloth and trading goods across an absolutely enormous network, stretching in every direction imaginable. And that trade network truly was enormous. Archaeologists have recovered more than 200,000 Islamic silver coins from hoards buried across Scandinavia currency that had travelled up through river routes along the Volga, passed hand to hand through Rus trading settlements connecting Norse traders all the way to the Abbasid Caliphate centred in Baghdad, thousands of miles from the nearest fjord. An Arab diplomat named Ibn Fadlan, travelling through that same river network in the early 900s, left behind a detailed eyewitness account of encountering Norse traders, directly describing their appearance, their customs, and a striking ship burial ceremony he personally witnessed on the river bank. Open his account today, and you're looking at one of the closest things we have to a first-hand on-the-ground description of these people written by someone who actually met them face to face, and not one single sentence of it mentions a horned helmet. Meanwhile, over in Iceland, Norse settlers were doing something else entirely unexpected for a people so often reduced to raiders in the popular imagination. In the year 930, local chieftains gathered at an open plain called Thingvellir and formally established an assembly known as the Althing, where free men debated law, settled disputes, and made collective decisions for the entire island standing beneath open sky, beside a natural rock formation that carried a speaker's voice clearly across the crowd. With a few interruptions along the way, that same institution has continued in some form ever since, making it one of the oldest continuously running parliamentary bodies anywhere on Earth, older by centuries than most of the governments we currently consider ancient and venerable. And here is a detail I honestly cannot resist sharing, because it flips the whole savage barbarian image completely upside down. A 13th century English monk named John of Wallingford, writing about earlier Danish settlers in England, complained bitterly that local women found these newcomers a little too attractive for comfort. According to his own account, the Danes combed their hair daily, bathed weekly, and changed their clothes regularly, and this apparently caused no small amount of trouble for English husbands trying to hold on to their wives. We should treat Wallingford's more dramatic claims with a healthy pinch of scepticism, since medieval chroniclers rarely resisted a good exaggeration, but the underlying pattern holds up remarkably well against the archaeology. Combs, tweezers, and small grooming kits turn up constantly in Norse graves for men and women alike, and the Norse word for Saturday itself, still used across Scandinavia and Iceland today, translates roughly to washing day. Somewhere along the way, the fearsome unwashed raider of popular imagination was in reality rather more likely to be the best-groomed person in the room. Doesn't it feel strange holding both images side by side in your head at once? A people organised enough to run a working legal assembly for free citizens, trade silver across thousands of miles of river and open ocean, and forge chain mail, one careful ring at a time, and yet somehow in our shared imagination we still mostly picture them as little more than horned screaming chaos on legs. I think that gap says less about the actual Norse world than it does about us, and about how much more easily a striking image travels than a patient complicated truth. A costume designer under deadline pressure gets remembered for a century and a half, quoted and copied on merchandise he never survived to see a single penny from. A working parliament, a continent-spanning trade network, and the only honest surviving helmet we have ever pulled from the ground barely register as common knowledge at all, tucked away in museum placards. Most visitors walk straight past on their way to somewhere else. It truly says something uncomfortable about which kinds of stories we are naturally wired to keep, and which ones we quietly let slip through our fingers generation after generation without ever noticing the trade we just made. And that exact same gap, it turns out, is about to show up again in a slightly different costume. Because the next lie waiting for us has nothing to do with helmet ships or opera houses at all. It is about something far bigger and far more personal, the quiet, ordinary texture of daily life for the overwhelming majority of people who are never raiding, never fighting, and never doing anything remotely dramatic enough to earn themselves a single sentence in anybody's history book at all. Let's step inside a courtroom for a moment, because it might be the single best window we have into what an ordinary day actually looked like. On a September afternoon in the year 1392, in a small English village called Little Downham, a manor court gathered to deal with the pressing business of the week. A local official stood up and reported that 8 stray animals had wandered onto the Lord's land: a mare, a brown mare travelling with her foal, a grey mare travelling with her own foal, a grey female foal on her own, and 2 black steers. Nobody had come forward to claim them, so the court ordered the discovery announced around the neighbourhood in case an owner turned up. 2 months later, a man arrived with 6 neighbours willing to vouch for him, to formally claim one particular horse, a distinctively marked mare, the record describes in the wonderfully specific language of the time as white and black spotted. Picture the scene for a second, because it is almost comedy on its own terms. A room full of serious robed officials carefully documenting the precise markings of a wandering horse, cross-examining neighbours weighing witness testimony, all with the same gravity you might expect from a treason trial. This was quite literally the medieval version of a lost and found board run, with the full ceremony of a proper legal proceeding. That right there is what an actual Tuesday looked like for most people living through the era we still casually call an age of constant warfare and terror. Not swords, not sieges. A committee meeting about a spotted horse. If you spend any real time inside surviving manor court records from villages across medieval England, this is the overwhelming pattern you find case after case, year after year. Someone's cow trampled a neighbour's grain before the harvest lots had been properly drawn. Someone let their pigs root through a shared field without permission. Someone ploughed a little too far into the strip of land beside their own, quietly stealing a few extra furrows in what the records sometimes bluntly call, without any pretense at politeness, plough theft. One village might spend an entire session arguing about whose responsibility it was to fix a shared fence after somebody's goose wandered through the gap and ruined a patch of cabbages. These are the actual disputes that filled up the actual courtrooms of actual medieval villages week after week for centuries. Not epic battles. Wandering livestock and petty property squabbles the exact same stuff. Any small claims court handles today, just with more mud and fewer parking tickets involved. So here's a question worth sitting with. If a historian 1,000 years from now had access to nothing but your own city's local news coverage headline after headline about the worst crimes and disasters of the year, would they walk away with an accurate picture of your actual Tuesday? Or would they assume your entire neighbourhood spent every waking hour in a state of panic and chaos? In a strange way, a medieval manor court was basically a small claims court crossed with the world's slowest neighbourhood group chat, minus the phones plus livestock. Somebody's goose gets loose, somebody's fence falls down, somebody's cousin owes somebody else 3 shillings from last Michaelmas, and the whole village shows up to hash it out in front of a bailiff, who's clearly heard all of this before and would very much like to go home for supper. That gap is not an accident, and it is not really anyone's fault either. It comes down to a simple, almost boring truth about how records get made in the first place. The people writing history down in this era, mostly monks and clergy, working in the same quiet scriptoriums we spent time inside earlier in this story, were not sitting around documenting ordinary Tuesdays. They recorded coronations, invasions, plagues, and the deaths of kings, because those were the events that felt important enough to preserve for the future. Nobody picked up a pen to solemnly record that the harvest came in fine this year, and nothing much happened, that the roof got mended, that a wedding took place without incident, and that supper that evening was better than usual because a neighbour shared some honey. The quiet, uneventful majority of medieval life simply never made it onto parchment in the first place, which means it is almost entirely missing from the story most of us grew up hearing, not because it did not happen, but because nobody thought to write it down. 1,000 ordinary days leave behind exactly one line of parchment between them, if that, while a single afternoon of chaos might fill an entire chapter. Now I want to be honest with you here, because pretending medieval life was some kind of gentle countryside picnic would be its own kind of lie. Violence was real. Warfare happened. Feuds between lords could turn brutal, and ordinary people absolutely suffered because of decisions made by men with swords and titles they never had any say in. Bands of soldiers moving between campaigns could, and did, terrorize the villages sitting in their path, and a bad lord or a lawless stretch of countryside could make daily life truly frightening, in a way no court record ever fully captures. I am not asking you to erase that part or to pretend the danger was imaginary. I am asking you to notice something more interesting sitting right alongside it. The fact that medieval society itself was keenly aware of this problem, took it seriously enough to lose sleep over it, and actually organized on purpose again and again to do something about it. Starting in the year 989, bishops across parts of France began holding what they called peace councils, enormous public gatherings where local lords and knights were invited, or in some cases firmly persuaded to attend. Priests would bring out the relics of every local church, sacred bones and fragments treated as the most solemn objects a person could swear an oath upon, and knights were asked in front of their entire community to publicly promise not to harm unarmed peasants, women merchants or clergy. Breaking that oath risked excommunication, a truly terrifying prospect in a deeply religious society, essentially a spiritual restraining order backed by the full authority of the church. A few decades later, the movement grew even bolder. What became known as the Truce of God went a step further, attempting to restrict violence to specific days of the week entirely. No fighting on Sundays, no fighting during Lent or Advent or most of the major religious feasts scattered throughout the year. In practice, that left knights a fairly narrow window, roughly the middle of the week, if they truly insisted on settling their disputes by force. It was not a perfect solution. Plenty of knights broke these oaths, and enforcement varied wildly from region to region, depending on how forcefully a particular bishop or a particular king was willing to push back. But think about what the whole effort actually represents. This was an entire society looking directly at its own capacity for violence and deciding collectively and repeatedly over the better part of a century that it needed active, organised limits. Regional councils met again and again to renew these oaths, adjust their terms and press the point home to a new generation of knights who had grown up watching their fathers make the same promise. That is not the behaviour of a culture that simply shrugged and accepted endless bloodshed as the natural order of things. Meanwhile, underneath all of that political manoeuvring, the actual rhythm of daily life ran on a completely different clock, the agricultural and religious calendar. Winter meant mending tools and staying near the fire. Spring meant ploughing and lambing. Summer meant the long, exhausting stretch of haymaking. Late summer into autumn brought the harvest itself, the single most important and cooperative undertaking of the entire year, when village bylaws often required every able body to pitch in together, and specific careful rules governed who was allowed to glean the leftover grain from the fields, typically reserved for the very young, the very old, and anyone unable to do the heavier reaping work with the whole village keeping a careful eye out to make sure the process stayed fair. The village itself was built for this kind of shared existence. A single communal oven often baked bread for every household in turn, because building and fueling a private oven made little sense when one large fire could feed the whole street. A shared well-supplied water. A single mill, usually owned by the lord but used by everyone, ground the grain that kept the entire community fed, and arguments over whose turn it was at the millstone show, up in the records almost as often as the arguments over stray livestock. Even leisure carried this same communal streak. Villagers played a rough, chaotic early form of football that authorities in some English towns eventually tried to ban, outright worried that grown men chasing an inflated bladder through crowded streets was causing entirely too much property damage and too many broken bones to be worth the entertainment. That is not the image of a joyless, fearful people. That is the image of a community so full of energy and mischief that its own leaders occasionally had to step in and calm it down. Woven through that working calendar were the holy days, and there were a truly striking number of them. Every Sunday was at least in principle a day free from labour. Christmas stretched into a full 12 days of feasting, ending with the celebration in early January. Easter and the weeks round Pentecost brought their own stretches of rest and festivity. On top of all that, nearly every month carried its own local Saints' Day, often celebrated with processions, games, shared meals, and travel between neighbouring villages to visit friends and family. Historians still actively debate exactly how much total leisure time this added up to across a full year. Some studies suggesting nearly a third of the calendar, others arguing the real number was considerably lower, once you account for the constant unavoidable demands of caring for animals that do not politely pause for a holy day. But even the more conservative estimates paint a picture wildly different from the grim, joyless grind so many of us still quietly picture whenever someone says the word medieval. Doesn't that complicate things nicely? A society organising peace councils and swearing oaths on holy relics to limit nightly violence in the very same stretch of centuries where village court records are overwhelmingly filled with arguments about stray horses and shared grazing rights, all while the calendar itself was dotted with feast days, processions, and travel to visit family. Picture a family setting out on foot along a muddy road in early spring, walking half a day to reach a neighbouring village for a Saints' Day fair, children running ahead, someone carrying a basket of bread to share music drifting from somewhere near the church. None of that erases the genuine hardship, the disease, the very real warfare that did happen. But it refuses to let that hardship stand in as the entire story, the way it so often does in the version most of us inherited, without ever really questioning it. I think part of what happened here is that one particularly brutal stretch of time within this era ended up quietly standing in for the whole thing. The 1300s in particular really were catastrophic across much of Europe. Devastating famine early in the century, the Black Death arriving mid-century and killing a staggering share of the population, and a long grinding war between England and France layered on top of all of it. Serious, careful historians have written entire excellent books specifically about how calamitous that 1 century truly was. But a book about one especially brutal 100 years absorbed casually and stretched backward and forward in the popular imagination has a way of quietly becoming shorthand for an entire 1,000-year stretch of human history. It was never actually describing in the first place. I keep noticing that same shape everywhere we look in this story, honestly. Someone captures one real specific, sometimes truly terrible slice of time with total accuracy, and then slowly, without anyone quite deciding to do it on purpose, that one slice quietly swallows every century standing next to it. the way a single stormy week can somehow end up defining an entire summer in someone's memory, even though the sun was out for most of it. Maybe that is worth carrying with you the next time a single loud dramatic headline threatens to define an entire year, or an entire place, or an entire group of people in your own mind. Somewhere underneath that headline there is very likely a village court quietly arguing about a spotted horse, a family sharing a meal, a group of neighbours taking their turn at the oven entirely unremarkable, entirely real, and almost never the version of events that gets remembered. And speaking of things quietly swallowed by their own worst chapter, the very next lie waiting for us belongs to an institution that has spent the last few centuries wearing almost the exact same unfair reputation. Not a whole era this time, but a single organisation accused for generations of standing squarely in the way of curiosity itself, of locking away knowledge instead of protecting it, which once you actually go looking at what its own libraries, schools and scholars were doing behind those walls turns out to be one more story that barely resembles the version we were handed. On a cold evening in February in the year 1229, a group of students in Paris got into an argument with the tavern keeper over an unpaid bill right in the middle of the boisterous wine-soaked festivities of the season before Lent. It was by every surviving account a small, stupid, entirely ordinary dispute, the kind of thing that happens in college towns in every century, in every language usually forgotten by the following morning. It escalated into a brawl, tables overturned, fists flying, the tavern keeper shouting for help. The local city watch called in to restore order ended up killing several of the students involved without any trial, without any of the legal protections those students were technically supposed to have as members of the university protections that were meant to place them under church jurisdiction, rather than the rough justice of the local guard. Here is where the story stops matching the version most of us grew up with. The scholars of Paris did not quietly accept this. They organised. Every master stopped teaching. Every student packed up and left the city entirely, some scattering as far as England and Italy, and the greatest centre of learning in Europe simply shut its doors and stayed shut for more than 2 full years in open protest. Try picturing that for a second. Not a single lecture, not a single class, an entire university walking out refusing to return until somebody in power took their rights seriously. Eventually it worked. The Pope himself stepped in, and in the year 1231 issued a formal document that came to be treated almost like a founding constitution for the university, praising Paris as, in his own words, a mother of the sciences, a place where wisdom tested the raw material of the mind, the way a smith tests metal, separating gold from waste. That document guaranteed the scholars protection from exactly the kind of local interference that had gotten their fellow students killed in the first place, placing the entire university directly under papal authority, so that no local lord bishop or city official could push it around again. Masters were even granted the right to suspend lectures again in the future as a formal recognised tool if the university's rights were ever threatened a second time. In effect, the single most powerful religious authority in Western Christendom had just handed a group of scholars a permanent enforceable strike clause. I want you to sit with that for a moment because it directly contradicts almost everything the popular version of this story wants you to believe. The Church, the very institution so often accused of chaining down curiosity and punishing independent thought, was the exact body that stepped in here to protect scholars from violence and guarantee their freedom to keep studying, teaching, and arguing without interference. Here's a question worth turning over in your mind. If the Church's real day-to-day relationship with learning was one of constant suppression, why would it have spent 2 years fighting to reopen a university, sending bishops to negotiate on its behalf, rather than simply letting the whole thing quietly disappear and redirecting all that money towards something safer, because that university was never some fringe-tolerated accident either. It was one of dozens springing up across Europe during these very centuries, almost all of them founded with direct church backing. Bologna had already been running since the end of the 1100s. Oxford had grown out of an earlier cluster of church schools. When a town and gown conflict later drove a group of scholars out of Oxford entirely, they simply founded a brand new university a short distance away in a town called Cambridge, and that new school adopted the same basic model. Students at these universities followed a curriculum built around a core set of subjects that had been organised centuries earlier: arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy, alongside grammar, logic and rhetoric, an entire structured educational pathway designed to train the mind before it ever touched theology at all. These were not secret rebellions against religious authority. They were built by it, funded by it, staffed largely by clergy, and repeatedly defended by it whenever local powers tried to interfere. And what were students actually doing inside these institutions? Sitting quietly memorizing approved answers forbidden from questioning anything? Not even a little bit. The core teaching method used across these medieval universities was something called disputation, structured formal argument, where a question would be posed publicly, sometimes something as pointed as whether the world had always existed, or whether motion could occur in a vacuum, and a student had to argue one side. Another had to argue the opposing side, and a master would weigh both arguments in front of an audience before rendering judgment. Some universities even held special open sessions, sometimes called quadlibetal disputations, where any scholar in the room could raise absolutely any question they liked on any subject, and the presiding master had to answer it on the spot in public with no advance warning. Surviving records from these sessions show masters fielding truly wild questions on the spot. Everything from the nature of angels to whether it was permissible to eat meat on a technicality, during a fast forced to reason their way through an answer in real time, in front of colleagues who were more than happy to point out any weak logic. Entire academic careers were built on the skill of arguing rigorously against a popular position in public in front of your own teachers. That is not the culture of blind obedience we tend to imagine. That is closer to a many centuries-old ancestor of the college debate team, except with slightly higher stakes and considerably less casual clothing. Now let me introduce you to one particular churchman who embodies this entire contradiction almost perfectly, because his story tends to surprise people the most. His name was Robert Grosseteste, born into a modest, unremarkable family somewhere in the English countryside sometime in the 1170s, with no obvious path toward greatness at all, no title, no fortune, nothing handed to him. Through sheer persistence and intellectual talent, he rose to become the very first Chancellor of Oxford University, and later the Bishop of Lincoln, one of the most powerful churchmen in England, a man who addressed popes and advised kings. And in between those two very serious jobs, he found time to essentially lay early groundwork for what we would now recognize as scientific method. Grosseteste was fascinated by light. He wrote entire treatises trying to understand how it moved, how it bent through water and glass, why rainbows formed the way they did, arranging small experiments with mirrors and lenses in an era when most people simply accepted a rainbow as a pretty mystery and moved on with their day. But what makes him remarkable is not simply what he studied, it is how he insisted on studying it. He argued that a thinker should start from careful observation, work backward to identify the underlying principle at play, a process he called resolution, and then use that principle to build forward toward a fuller explanation, a process he called composition. And crucially, he insisted that any resulting theory needed to be tested against real physical experience before anyone should trust it, a step he referred to directly as experiment. Historians still debate exactly how far to credit him as a direct ancestor of modern experimental science, since medieval thought worked inside its own logic and vocabulary rather than ours. But nobody seriously disputes that a 13th century bishop was sitting in Lincoln grinding lenses, tracking beams of light and insisting that observation and testing mattered more than simply trusting old authorities. One of his own students at Oxford, a Franciscan friar named Roger Bacon, took that same instinct even further, pushing hard for careful, repeatable experimentation as the proper foundation for any real claim about the natural world, and later scholars would credit both men as quiet forerunners of an entire scientific tradition still centuries away from having a name of its own. He was not the only churchman turning this kind of rigorous doubt toward the heavens either. About a century later, a French bishop named Nicole Oresme, who spent years teaching at the University of Paris before eventually taking up his own post at the Cathedral of Lisieux, sat down and seriously worked through the possibility that the Earth itself spins on its own axis, roughly 200 years before Copernicus made the same idea famous. Oresme carefully dismantled the standard objections people raised against it, including the old argument that an arrow shot straight upward should land somewhere else entirely if the ground beneath it were actually turning. He showed through careful reasoning about how motion combines why that argument simply did not hold up. In the end, Oresme concluded that observation alone could never fully settle the question one way or the other, and for reasons of his own tied to faith as much as physics, he chose not to fully commit to the idea. But the fact that a bishop was rigorously testing and very nearly accepting one of the most radical scientific claims in human history, centuries before it became common knowledge, tells you something important about what was actually happening inside these supposedly narrow, rigid institutions. Doesn't that complicate the picture a little? A bishop, one of the most senior churchmen in an entire country, spending his free hours testing how light bends through glass, and training the next generation to demand evidence before belief. So where did the popular idea of an all-out war between faith and reason actually come from, if the daily reality inside these universities looked more like organized, protected, rigorous debate? Quite a lot of it traces back to a single, very famous, very dramatic trial. The case of an Italian astronomer condemned by church authorities for defending the idea that the Earth orbits the Sun. It is a real, serious, well-documented event tangled up in genuine politics, genuine personal rivalries, and a genuine clash between an aging institution and a stubborn, brilliant man who refused to soften his language for anyone. It deserves its own honest telling on its own terms, and I'm not here tonight to wave it away or pretend it never happened. But here is the detail that tends to get quietly dropped whenever that story gets used as proof that the whole medieval world was hostile to science. That trial did not happen anywhere near the centuries we've spent this entire story exploring together. It took place in the 1630s, deep into the era we now call the Renaissance, roughly 400 years after Robert Grosseteste was grinding his lenses in Lincoln, and centuries after universities across Europe had already been debating astronomy, optics, and mathematics in structured public arguments for generations. We already spent time earlier in this story watching how a couple of writers centuries later still took a single dramatic trial like that one and stretched it backward across an entire 1,000-year period. It never actually described turning one specific complicated 17th century courtroom drama into a blanket verdict against a much older, much broader, and far more curious world than the story ever gave it credit for. Isn't it strange how one loud singular headline can end up standing in for centuries of quiet, unremarkable classrooms it never actually touched? I think that is honestly the pattern sitting underneath almost everything we have uncovered together so far in this whole story. A real dramatic, memorable event happens in one specific place, at one specific moment, and it is simply easier for that vivid singular image to survive in our memory than the far quieter, far more widespread truth surrounding it on every side. A trial makes a better headline than 1,000 ordinary lecture halls filled with monks and bishops calmly arguing about the nature of light. Nobody ever made a gripping film about a peaceful century of scholars politely disagreeing with each other over dinner. Have you ever noticed how one striking exception can end up defining an entire category in your own mind long after the quieter majority around it has simply faded from memory? Think about your own field, your own city, your own family even. One dramatic story tends to get repeated at every gathering, while 100 quieter, kinder, more ordinary days simply vanish without ever being mentioned again. And once you start looking closely at what these medieval scholars were actually doing generation after generation, in libraries and lecture halls funded and protected by the very church we were taught to see as their enemy, the whole architecture of the myth starts to look almost embarrassingly thin. A bishop grinding lenses in Lincoln, a pope defending rioting students against his own local officials, universities built, funded and staffed by the very institution supposedly determined to keep everyone ignorant. It is not the tidy story of villains and heroes we were handed. It is something far messier and honestly far more human, which brings us quite naturally to the next lie waiting for us in this story, because it involves an entire category of supposedly medieval objects sitting in museums and gift shops around the world, today gleaming, spiked and terrifying, and almost completely provably invented centuries after the fact by people with a very different set of motives than historical accuracy. Walk into almost any castle gift shop in Europe today, and somewhere near the postcards and the plastic swords you will probably find a small metal replica of a coffin, lined with spikes usually shaped roughly like a standing human body, with a hinged door and a painted, vaguely serene face on the front. Maybe a tour guide waits just outside the dungeon exit, ready to lower their voice dramatically, as your group files past the real, full-sized version, chained off behind a velvet rope for effect. The placard nearby will almost certainly use the word medieval, and almost everything about that word in this particular case turns out to be wrong. The object is called an Iron Maiden, and the story attached to it is deliciously grim. A prisoner is sealed inside the spiked door, swings shut, and death comes slowly from dozens of shallow wounds, rather than one clean blow, precisely engineered cruelty dressed up as justice. It is one of the single most recognizable images of the entire medieval period in the popular imagination, right up there with the horned Viking helmet we already took apart earlier in this story. There is just one small problem with it. As far as historians can tell, nothing resembling that device existed anywhere in Europe during the Middle Ages at all. Let's trace the story back to its actual root, because it is far more interesting than the myth itself. The very first written reference to an Iron Maiden anywhere comes from a German scholar named Johann Philipp Siebenkees, writing in the year 1793. In his account, he describes a coin forger executed inside a spiked iron cabinet in the city of Nuremberg, all the way back in the year 1515. It reads like a solid historical record, precise date, specific crime, named location. Except historians who went looking for Siebenkees' original source were never able to find one. No court record from Nuremberg mentions any such execution. No earlier chronicle from that city or anywhere else describes a device anything like it. Centuries of detailed judicial paperwork survive from Nuremberg's courts, meticulous documentation of fines, floggings, beheadings, and every other punishment the city ever handed down, and not one page of it says a single word about an Iron Maiden. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If a torture device this dramatic, this visually unforgettable, had truly been used across medieval Europe for centuries, wouldn't you expect at least one surviving eyewitness account, one court record, one chronicler horrified enough to write it down somewhere? The actual physical object most people picture when they hear the phrase Iron Maiden was not built until around 1802, roughly 300 years after its supposed first use, constructed specifically for public display in Nuremberg, carved and hinged to look suitably ancient and weathered. It became something of a sensation. It was later sold to an English collector, shipped across the ocean, exhibited at the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893 alongside marvels of modern engineering, and then toured around the United States afterward as a curiosity for paying crowds, city after city lining up to gasp at a device that had never actually been used to hurt anyone. The original was eventually destroyed by Allied bombing during the Second World War, which means the most famous surviving evidence for a supposedly medieval torture device met its actual end from 20th century airplanes, rather than anything resembling its own legend, a strange, almost poetic irony sitting right there in the wreckage. So where did the idea even come from, if not from genuine medieval practice? Historians think it likely grew out of confusion, or maybe convenient reinterpretation, involving a real medieval device called a shame coat, a bulky wood and metal garment forced onto poachers or prostitutes and paraded through town so the whole community could jeer and throw rotten vegetables at them. The point of the shame coat was public humiliation, not death, and certainly not slow bleeding from dozens of hidden wounds. Truly unpleasant, truly humiliating, and entirely without spikes. Somewhere between that real, well-documented device and the eager imagination of 18th century storytellers, hungry for a better story than a wooden coat and some rotten cabbage, the shame coat quietly grew fangs. If you had to guess before hearing any of this which of the two objects in tonight's story actually existed, the plain wooden shaming garment or the spiked iron coffin, which one would your gut have picked? Most people I know would have bet on the spikes every time. That alone tells you something about which version of the past we have quietly trained ourselves to expect. And the timing of that transformation is not a coincidence. The 1760s saw the publication of a wildly popular novel called The Castle of Otranto, widely credited as the very first work of Gothic fiction, packed with crumbling castles, secret passageways, and lurking dread. It set off an entire cultural craze, spawning imitators by the dozen each one, competing to describe darker dungeons and more elaborate suffering than the last. Suddenly tourists wanted to visit real castle ruins and imagine exactly that kind of delicious horror lurking in the basement, paying good money for the privilege of feeling a pleasant little chill run down their spine. And castle owners quite understandably discovered that a properly blood-curdling dungeon exhibit was wonderful for business. A little embellishment here, a spiked prop there, and suddenly your crumbling old keep, otherwise just a pile of damp stone with a leaky roof, had a story worth the price of admission, a paying line of visitors and a gift shop to match. I think that is honestly one of the most human details buried inside this entire story. The image of medieval barbarism we still carry around in our heads today was largely assembled by enterprising showmen working roughly 300 years after the fact, giving paying customers exactly the shiver they had shown up hoping to feel. It is in its own strange way one of the earliest tourism industries on record, built almost entirely on convincing visitors that the past had been worse than it actually was. Now, if you thought that particular myth was well protected, wait until you hear about its nearest cousin, one that manages to be somehow even less grounded in reality. You've almost certainly heard some version of this one too. A knight rides off on crusade, and before he leaves he locks his wife into a metal undergarment, fitted with a small padlock ensuring her fidelity, until he returns sometimes years later. It is presented as common medieval practice, a grim little footnote about how women's bodies were treated as property to be secured like a strongbox. It shows up in museum displays in historical fiction, in casual jokes about the bad old days, usually accompanied by a knowing little laugh, as though everyone already agrees this part of history is simply too well established to question. A medievalist named Albrecht Classen finally got tired enough of this particular story that he decided to run down every single piece of supposed evidence for it one by one across an entire book. He was by his own account a professor who had simply heard this claim repeated as settled fact one too many times in lectures and casual conversation, and he wanted to know exactly where it actually came from. What he found was almost nothing. The very earliest image resembling a chastity belt appears in a book from the year 1405, an illustrated catalogue of military engineering siege towers, battering rams, catapults, and tucked in among all of that hardware. One small drawing of a locking device worn by a woman presented in a context that reads far more like a curious oddity, almost a joke sitting alongside truly deadly siege weapons than a serious how-to guide for anxious husbands. Beyond that single sketch, Classen found essentially nothing solid. No medical text mentions treating the injuries such a device would obviously cause, and medieval medicine wrote about plenty of far more delicate matters than that. No legal code regulates its use despite medieval law being famously thorough about property, marriage, and inheritance. No sermon, no confession manual, no moralizing church document, all genres that discussed marriage and sexuality at exhausting length throughout this era, sometimes down to uncomfortably specific detail, ever once mentions it either. For an object supposedly common enough to shape an entire cultural stereotype, it left behind an almost perfectly empty paper trail in a period that otherwise wrote down an enormous amount about far more mundane concerns. What Classen did find again and again were poems and songs joking about locks and keys in a clearly metaphorical sense, the same way we might jokingly say someone holds the key to another person's heart today, without meaning an actual physical object changes hands. As Classen himself has pointed out, even the jokes about the idea tend to include a wandering lover, who conveniently already has a spare key, which rather undercuts the entire premise as a serious security measure. He has described the whole persistent fantasy as rooted less in real medieval practice, and more in a kind of timeless male anxiety, dressed up in period costume. It reads far more like an old slightly bawdy joke about the impossibility of controlling desire than a genuine piece of medieval hardware, the sort of thing a group of men might have laughed about over wine, not something a blacksmith was ever seriously commissioned to forge. So what about the actual metal objects sitting in museum cases labelled medieval chastity belt? The ones people have stared at in glass display cases for over a century, often with a slightly embarrassed laugh. When museum conservators eventually ran proper analysis on several of these pieces, examining the metal alloys, the welding marks and the manufacturing techniques used to shape the hinges and locks, the results consistently pointed toward the 17 and 1800s, not the medieval period at all. Some institutions had displayed these objects confidently for generations before anyone thought to actually test them. The British Museum, to its credit, now states plainly on its own records that most surviving examples were almost certainly created centuries later, either as curiosities for wealthy collectors with a taste for the risque, or simply as tasteless jokes, crafted by enterprising metalworkers who understood exactly what kind of story would make an object sell. Doesn't that reframe the whole story rather nicely? Not a common medieval security device at all, but a persistent, slightly dirty joke taken far too seriously several centuries after the punchline had already landed. Have you ever noticed how much easier it is to believe something scandalous about people who are not around to correct the record themselves? Medieval people left behind no lawyers, no publicists, no descendants standing in the room, ready to push back when a Victorian antique dealer decided a spiked iron cabinet or a locking metal garment might sell rather well to a curious, slightly thrilled customer. In a strange way, the whole business was an early, remarkably successful ancestor of modern dark tourism centuries before anyone had a word for it, selling manufactured dread to travellers who wanted a story to bring home more than they wanted an accurate one, because that really does seem to be the through line connecting both of these objects. Real medieval Europe left behind plenty of genuine cruelty, worth taking seriously court records of actual punishments, actual executions, actual injustice, none of which needed a single spike or padlock invented to make the point. What it did not leave behind were these two specific cartoonishly elaborate props, both of which trace back with remarkable clarity once you actually go looking to entrepreneurial storytellers working centuries later, perfectly happy to hand curious tourists exactly the shiver or the smirk they had paid good money to feel. And there is something almost fitting about how both of these myths quietly centre on controlling a body against its will, one imagined for punishing the guilty, one imagined for policing a woman's fidelity, both entirely fictional, both projected backward onto people who never actually built either one. I keep coming back to how tidy that is, honestly, and how telling. We did not just invent random medieval nonsense at random. We reached again and again for images of bodies controlled, confined, and punished, and then called it history, which makes the story waiting for us next feel like the perfect overdue correction. Because it turns out the real record of women moving through this exact same stretch of centuries looks almost nothing like a woman locked away and waiting for a husband's return. It looks a great deal more like women running estates, negotiating treaties, running businesses, and occasionally outmaneuvering every man in the room with no iron cage, real or imagined, ever standing in their way. In the year 1106, in a small German household, a family made a decision that was fairly ordinary for the time. Their youngest daughter, a sickly, unusually observant child of about 8 years old, was sent away to live enclosed beside a religious woman to be raised inside the walls of a monastery rather than inside a home. She grew up almost entirely within those stone walls, learning her letters, learning to sing, learning to pray, and quietly to see things other people around her did not flashes of light and shape that she would later describe as feeling like a living flame moving through her whole body. Nobody watching that small girl leave could have possibly guessed they were looking at a future composer whose music is still being recorded and performed today, a scientist whose medical writing would be studied 9 centuries later, and a woman bold enough to personally scold the most powerful ruler in Europe to his face. Her name was Hildegard, and by the time she died at the remarkable age of 81, she had quietly rewritten almost every assumption we still carry around about what a woman in this era was allowed to become. For decades, Hildegard kept the vision she experienced almost entirely to herself, unsure what to make of them, unwilling to risk the accusation of madness. Or worse, in an era when a woman claiming direct spiritual insight could easily be dismissed or condemned outright. It was only in her 40s, well past the point most of us associate with the beginning of a serious new career, that she finally began writing them down, describing brilliant lights and symbolic figures in language rich enough that later scholars would spend centuries trying to fully unpack it. She later said the decision came only after a period of illness so severe she truly believed it might be a punishment for her silence. and that the moment she finally began writing the sickness eased. That decision alone would have secured her a footnote in history. It was only the beginning. Alongside her theological visions, Hildegard produced detailed scientific writing on plants, minerals, and the natural world, cataloguing their properties and medicinal uses with the careful, systematic eye of a working naturalist, work still occasionally cited by historians of medicine today for what it reveals about practical healing knowledge in her time. She composed an entire original cycle of liturgical music melodies, distinctive enough that modern musicologists can usually recognize her work within a few notes, soaring and unusually wide-ranging for the era built for voices that seem to reach upward rather than settle comfortably in place. Recordings of her compositions are still being released and performed in concert halls today, nearly 900 years after she wrote them, making her, by some counts, one of the most recorded composers from the entire medieval period, male or female. As if that were not enough, she also invented her own alphabet and vocabulary, an entirely constructed language known today as the unknown tongue, complete with its own script, for reasons scholars still debate whether private devotion intellectual play or something closer to a secret shared only among her own community of nuns. And she did all of this while corresponding as an equal partner in conversation, rather than a passive subject, with 4 different popes, 2 Holy Roman emperors, and dozens of abbots, bishops, and fellow abbesses across the German-speaking world. Nearly 400 of her letters survive today, one of the largest bodies of personal correspondence to come down to us from this entire era, regardless of who wrote it. Here's the detail that tends to stop people in their tracks. When Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, one of the most powerful men in Europe, threw his support behind a disputed rival pope for political reasons of his own, Hildegard wrote to him directly, warning him in blunt, uncompromising language that he was endangering his own soul, and urging him to reconsider addressing an emperor the way a stern teacher might address a promising but wayward student, without a trace of the polite hedging you might expect from someone with no army, no title, and no formal political standing whatsoever. A cloistered nun writing to an emperor, essentially telling him he was making a serious mistake. And he did not simply dismiss her. Their correspondence continued for years. Near the very end of her own life, she showed that same stubborn conviction, again allowing the burial of a previously excommunicated man inside her convent's own cemetery, because he had reconciled with the church before he died. Local church authorities responded by placing her entire community under an interdict, cutting them off from receiving the sacraments. Hildegard refused to back down, appealed the decision directly, and eventually won. Have you ever wondered what it would take for someone with almost no formal political power to speak that plainly to the single most powerful person in their world and still be taken seriously? Hildegard apparently figured it out sometime in her 40s and never really stopped afterward. Toward the end of her life, she even pushed to move her entire community of nuns away from the male monastery that had technically overseen them for decades, founding an independent convent of her own at a site called Rupertsberg, over the initial objections of the monks who stood to lose both authority and income from the move. According to her own community's later accounts, when the abbot resisted, Hildegard took to her bed, struck by an illness so severe it seemed she might die, and only recovered once permission for the move was finally granted. A pattern of illness and recovery tightly bound up with her own will that appears more than once across her biography. She won that argument too, relocating her nuns, negotiating the purchase of land, and later founding a second convent as well, effectively building and running her own independent religious institution, at an age when many of her contemporaries, male or female, were long past any new undertakings at all. Hildegard was by any honest measure an extraordinary individual, not a typical one, but her story matters here for a different reason. It shows us the outer edge of what was truly possible for a woman in this era, and once you know that edge exists, it becomes a lot easier to notice all the more ordinary women quietly living somewhere closer to it than the popular imagination usually allows. Take the world of trade and commerce far away from convents and correspondence with emperors. Under the everyday law of the time, a married woman in much of medieval Europe was technically folded into her husband's legal identity, unable to independently sign contracts or be sued in her own name. But English towns London especially developed a specific legal workaround for exactly this problem, a status known as femme sole, literally meaning a woman alone. Under this status, a married woman running her own trade could be treated for business purposes as though she were legally single, fully responsible for her own contracts, her own debts, and her own profits entirely separate from her husband's affairs. And women use that status to run real substantial businesses. Brewing in particular was overwhelmingly female work for much of this period, so thoroughly associated with women that the very word used for a brewer-brewster carries a feminine ending baked directly into the language itself, alongside another common term, alewife, which needs no further explanation at all. Picture a market square on a busy morning, rows of stalls, the smell of fresh bread and boiling grain, women calling out prices, weighing goods, tallying debts owed from the week before, arguing good-naturedly with regular customers who tried to talk down the price of a jug of ale. Market stalls selling ale, bread, eggs and dairy were staffed largely by women bargaining, competing and building reputations across entire trading seasons, reputations that mattered enormously in towns small enough for everyone to know exactly whose ale was watered down and whose could be trusted. Widows frequently stepped directly into their late husbands' trades, sometimes formally admitted into the same guilds that otherwise limited female membership, continuing businesses that might have collapsed entirely without their expertise, their existing customer relationships, and their own hard-won knowledge of the craft. I want to be careful here the way we have tried to be careful with every myth we have taken apart together in this story. This was never universal equality dressed up in medieval clothing. Femme-sole status was a specific legal tool used by a limited number of women, mostly in larger trading towns, and the underlying assumption of the era still very much treated a married woman's identity as legally merged with her husband's by default. But the fact that the law needed a specific named workaround for women who were in practice, already running independent businesses, tells you something important. The law was reacting to a reality that had outgrown its original assumptions, not inventing that reality from nothing. And then there is the world of outright political power sitting at the very top of the social order. A granddaughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a French queen named Blanche of Castile, twice stepped in as regent of an entire kingdom once, when her young son inherited the throne as a child of only 12, and again years later when that same son, now grown into King Louis IX, left the country entirely to fight overseas. The first time rebellious barons gathered almost immediately, assuming a woman ruling on behalf of a child would fold quickly under pressure. Blanche personally rode out with an army to relieve a besieged town, negotiated alliances, and out-argued nobles twice her rank in age and experience, holding the fractured kingdom together through years of open rebellion until her son was old enough to rule outright. Twice Blanche effectively ran France on her own, facing down rebellious nobles who assumed a female regent would be an easy target, and twice she outmaneuvered them, holding the kingdom together until her son could return and rule in his own right. Doesn't that complicate the picture a little more layered right on top of everything else we have found tonight? An abbess correcting an emperor, brewsters and market women running their own accounts under their own names, a queen ruling an entire kingdom twice while everyone waited for her to fail. So why does the opposite image, the silent, powerless medieval woman with no say in her own life, still feel like the default setting in so many of our heads? I think it comes down to which documents survive most easily, and which ones get treated as the whole truth rather than one version of it. Legal codes and church doctrine, the kind of formal official writing that tends to survive in tidy organised archives, mostly describe an ideal, a theory of how society was supposed to work with women neatly subordinate to fathers and husbands, tucked safely inside a tidy legal category. Court records, guild registers, personal letters and account books. The messier, more scattered paperwork of actual daily life tell a wildly different story, full of women who simply did not stay inside the lines. The theory drew for them, who ran shops, argued in court, brewed beer, ruled kingdoms, and corresponded with emperors, while the official theory quietly insisted they were doing no such thing. We keep running into that exact same gap throughout this whole story, honestly, the official version written down in one register, and the far messier, more interesting reality, quietly humming along in a completely different one. It is almost funny in a slightly exhausting way how consistently the tidy paperwork loses to the messy truth every single time we actually bother to check. Have you ever caught yourself assuming an entire group of people must have all shared one single kind of life, simply because that is the version that happened to survive in the textbooks? What do you think gets left out of the official record about your own life right now? If someone only had access to your tax forms and your birth certificate 1,000 years from now, and here is a thought worth carrying with you before we move any further. All of this, the abbess correcting emperors, the Brewsters guarding their own accounts, the Queen holding a kingdom together twice over, was still happening in a world that had absolutely no idea what was about to arrive. Hildegard died peacefully in her own bed at Rupertsberg, surrounded by the community she had fought so hard to build more than a century and a half before the worst of it. Because not long after women like these built their quiet, hard-won independence, an entirely different kind of force was about to sweep through Europe, one that did not care about status, title, guild membership or legal category at all. One that would walk straight past every Abbess Brewster and Queen we have just met tonight without the slightest hesitation, and it would test every single institution we have spent this story getting to know. That force, of course, was the Black Death arriving in Europe in the year 1347, and tearing through the continent for roughly the next 4 years, killing somewhere near a third of the entire population, before it finally eased its grip, wiping out entire villages so completely that some simply vanished from the map, their fields left untended for a generation. It is truly one of the darkest chapters in this entire story, and I am not going to pretend otherwise tonight. But even here, especially here, the popular image and the documented reality have drifted quite far apart from each other, and untangling the two tells us something almost hopeful about how people actually behaved when the ground fell out from under them. Picture the scene most of us carry around in our heads when we hear the words Black Death. Crowds of half-naked figures marching through the streets, whipping their own backs, bloody wailing about sin and judgment, an entire continent collapsing into religious hysteria overnight. That image is real in the sense that it did happen. It is just far smaller, far shorter, and far less representative of the overall response than the popular imagination tends to suggest. The flagellant movement, as it came to be called, did spread rapidly across parts of Germany. Flanders and beyond, beginning around 1348, groups of penitents, travelling from town to town, publicly scourging themselves with knotted whips in an attempt to appease what they believed was God's anger, drawing large emotional crowds wherever they passed through. But barely a year later, the very institution supposedly too backward to notice anything was wrong, stepped in and shut the whole movement down. In October of 1349, the Pope himself issued a formal condemnation explicitly banning the flagellant processions across France, Germany, Poland, Sweden and England, instructing local bishops to actively suppress them. That same Pope had already the year before issued a separate direct order, protecting Jewish communities from being blamed for the plague at a moment when frightened crowds in several cities had begun murdering their Jewish neighbours, accusing them of deliberately poisoning wells. He condemned those killings in the strongest terms available to him, forbade anyone from forcing Jewish people to convert under threat of violence, and personally offered protection to refugees who fled to papal territory. Neither of those decisions describes a civilization that had simply lost its mind. They describe an institution actively pushing back against exactly the kind of panic we tend to assume swallowed everyone whole. Here's a question worth sitting with. If the entire medieval world had truly descended into pure religious hysteria, with no capacity for organized rational response, why would one of its central authorities have spent real political capital shutting a popular, emotionally satisfying movement down within a single year? Because here is what was actually happening in parallel in the busy trading ports along the Adriatic coast, and it is honestly one of my favourite discoveries in this entire story. In the small but wealthy maritime republic of Ragusa, in what is now the Croatian city of Dubrovnik City, leaders were watching ship after ship arrive from plague-stricken ports and drawing a very practical conclusion. Whatever this sickness was, it seemed to travel with people, and cargo not simply drift through the air at random. A physician working in the city, a man named Jacob of Padua, began advising officials to isolate suspected carriers outside the city walls, rather than letting them mingle freely with residents. It is worth pausing on that for a second. This was not a prayer or a procession or a plea for divine mercy. It was a working theory about how disease actually spread, tested against real observed outbreaks, and offered as practical advice by a trained physician to a government willing to listen. The city took that advice seriously enough to write it into law. Ragusa itself was, by the standards of the era, a remarkably well-run little state governed by a rector who served just one single month in office, before handing power to a successor, a system almost paranoid in its determination to prevent any one person from accumulating too much control. City built around that kind of careful, deliberate governance turned out to be exactly the kind of place capable of responding to a health crisis with policy instead of panic. On the 27th of July in the year 1377, Ragusa's governing council passed a formal ordinance. Anyone arriving from a region known to be affected by plague would not be permitted to enter the city or its territory until they had spent a full month isolated on one of the small islands just off the coast, waiting to see whether symptoms developed. They called that period a Trentino from their word for 30. 20 years later, city officials extended the isolation period to 40 days a length. They called a quarantina, and that single administrative decision is the direct ancestor of the English word we still use today every time we talk about quarantine. I want you to really sit with how remarkable that is. Centuries before anyone understood germs, viruses, or contagion in anything like our modern sense, a small city government looked at a pattern of arrivals and outbreaks, drew a truly scientific conclusion from pure observation, and built binding law around it, complete with real penalties for anyone who tried to sneak past the isolation islands early. This was not blind superstition dressed up as policy. It was applied statistics centuries ahead of the vocabulary needed to properly describe it, and Ragusa kept building on that foundation. Within 20 years, the city had established what historians consider one of the very first permanent public health offices anywhere in the world, a formal government department dedicated entirely to managing outbreaks, staffed and funded on an ongoing basis, rather than assembled in a panic each time sickness reappeared. By the 1420s, the city had appointed officials with a title that translates roughly to plague masters whose entire job was tracking the sick, recording the address of every affected household, noting family members who might have been exposed and managing the isolation islands where suspected cases were sent to wait things out. Within a few more decades, the city had even built a permanent stone quarantine building on one of those islands, staffed year-round with guards, gravediggers, cleaners, and a priest ready and waiting whether or not a single ship happened to be approaching that week. That is not just an early hospital system. That is early epidemiology contact tracing conducted by hand in ink, 600 years before anyone had a word for either term. Doesn't that reframe the whole picture rather beautifully? Not a world paralysed by superstition, but one city at least methodically building the exact institutional tools we would still recognise as sound public health policy today, purely from watching cause and effect play out again and again along its own harbour. Ships arrive, sickness follows a pattern, isolate the ships, watch the pattern change. It is almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight, and that simplicity is exactly the point. Good observation does not always require advanced theory. Sometimes it just requires someone willing to actually watch closely, and a government willing to act on what they saw. Now, before we leave this topic, I have to walk you through one more myth because it is one of the most persistent and honestly one of the sneakiest in this entire story. You almost certainly know a children's rhyme that goes something like "Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes. We all fall down, sung by children holding hands in a circle, before tumbling over together in a fit of giggles." And you have probably also heard the claim that hides underneath it, that this innocent little song is secretly a coded description of plague symptoms, the rosy circular rash, the flowers carried to mask the smell of the dead, the final collapse representing death itself. It is a wonderfully satisfying story. It also appears to be almost entirely invented, and remarkably recently at that. Folklorists who went digging for the rhyme's actual origins found something that completely undercuts the plague theory. The earliest confirmed printed version of the rhyme does not appear until 1881 in a collection of nursery rhymes published in England centuries after the last major outbreaks of plague had already faded from Europe, and even that early version reads more like a simple singing game than any kind of coded warning. And the very first person to publicly connect this children's song to the plague at all was an author writing a popular history book in 1961, presenting the theory as a clever, colourful aside rather than an established academic finding more atmosphere than argument. From that one book, the idea simply took on a life of its own, repeated so often by so many well-meaning teachers and parents, standing in a playground somewhere that it eventually felt older and more solid than it had any right to be. Folklorists who study exactly this kind of rhyme have a name for what happened next, something they call metafolklore, which is really just a fancy way of saying a piece of folklore about folklore, a story about a story repeated until nobody remembers it was ever meant to be a guess rather than a fact. Think about that gap for a second. If millions of frightened parents and children had actually been singing a coded plague warning to each other for 600 straight years, wouldn't you expect at least one written trace of it, somewhere along the way in a diary, a sermon, a collection of folk songs anywhere at all? Detailed personal diaries survive from London's own outbreak in the 1600s, describing daily life under plague in exhausting, sometimes unbearable detail. Not one of them mentions this rhyme or anything resembling it at all. I think what makes this particular myth so interesting is how gentle it is compared to almost everything else we have taken apart together in this story. Nobody profited from inventing it. No costume designer needed a striking silhouette, No novelist needed a dramatic courtroom scene. No showman needed to sell tickets. Someone simply noticed a strange sing-song rhyme reached for the most dramatic explanation available, and the rest of us, quite understandably, found that explanation too satisfying to let go of. There is something almost sweet about it. Honestly, a whole society quietly agreeing to believe a spookier bedtime story than the truth actually offered, purely because the spooky version made a better party fact. Have you ever caught yourself repeating a fact you were fairly sure was true, purely because it was a better story than the boring alternative? I know I have more than once, and I suspect most of us have somewhere in our own back pocket a nursery rhyme, a diet tip, a bit of family history that turns out to be exactly this same kind of gentle, well-meaning invention. So here is where that leaves us sitting together at the edge of one of history's darkest chapters. Real devastation, real grief on a scale almost impossible to picture. Honestly, entire families gone within days, entire villages left standing empty, and running quietly underneath all of it. Real careful, methodical people, drawing genuine conclusions from genuine evidence, building the earliest working blueprint for public health as we still understand it today, while a very different, very human tendency toward myth-making was already starting to grow up around the edges of the story, waiting patiently for centuries to fully bloom. And if watching one small Adriatic city quietly outthink an entire continent's worth of panic has taught us anything tonight, it is this. The label we've been handed for this whole era, dark, backward, stagnant, was never really describing the people who survived through it at all. It was describing our own difficulty imagining that ordinary, unglamorous people in the middle of unimaginable loss could still sit down together and calmly build something as patient and forward-looking as a public health system. That difficulty says more about us than it ever did about them, which means it is finally time, after everything we've uncovered together across this whole story, to step back, take in the entire shape of it at once, and ask the one question we have been quietly circling since the very beginning. What was actually happening everywhere else in the world, far beyond the borders of one small grieving corner of Europe, while one heartbroken poet centuries ago decided in a single private letter to call this entire age a shadow? So let's finally go looking for that answer, because it takes us thousands of miles away from the small grieving corner of Italy where this whole story began. Picture a city on the banks of the Tigris River sometime in the 9th century. The streets thick with the smell of ink and river water, camel caravans arriving daily loaded with manuscripts gathered from as far away as India and Byzantium. Inside a sprawling library known as the House of Wisdom, scholars from half a dozen faiths and languages sit shoulder to shoulder at long tables translating stacks of Greek, philosophy, Persian astronomy and Indian mathematics into Arabic, arguing cheerfully over the best word for a difficult concept, then quietly building entirely new fields of study on top of whatever they had just finished translating. Patrons paid translators by weighing their finished manuscripts against gold, a strange and wonderful detail that tells you exactly how highly this particular society valued a well-translated page. A century earlier, almost nothing of Aristotle's scientific writing existed anywhere outside a handful of specialist libraries. By the time this same movement had run its course, entire new disciplines had grown up around ideas these scholars had rescued, refined and quietly improved upon mathematics that would later be renamed algebra after an Arabic word medical textbooks European universities would still be assigning centuries later, and star charts precise enough that navigators were still relying on them long after the men who drew them had died. This was Baghdad at the exact same moment Petrarch's imagined darkness was supposedly swallowing the entire human world whole. One of the brightest minds working in that same intellectual orbit was a scholar named Ibn al-Haytham, who spent years experimenting with light lenses and shadow, eventually building an early version of a camera obscura and correctly arguing that sight begins in the eye and is processed by the brain rather than some ray shooting outward from the eye itself, an idea most earlier thinkers had simply accepted without testing, based on little more than confident guesswork passed down for generations. His work on optics was so far ahead of its moment that later scientists working centuries afterward in an entirely different part of the world, including men named Newton and Galileo, still found themselves citing him directly treating a scholar working in a supposedly benighted era as one of the very foundations their own discoveries were quietly built upon. Doesn't that complicate the picture rather beautifully? While one heartbroken poet centuries later sat in Italy convinced the entire human species had lost its spark, a man on the other side of the Mediterranean was quietly laying groundwork for the same science that would eventually put a telescope in Galileo's hands. That particular flame did not burn forever. In the year 1258, invading armies swept into Baghdad and destroyed huge portions of the city, including much of that same great library, and according to later chroniclers, so many manuscripts were thrown into the river that its waters reportedly ran black with ink for days, the accumulated knowledge of centuries dissolving into the current. Even here, though, the story refuses to end quite as darkly as it begins. Scholars who saw the danger coming rushed to save what they could, quietly carrying thousands of manuscripts out of the city ahead of the destruction smuggled out under cloaks and loaded onto carts bound for safer libraries further east, preserving enough of that accumulated knowledge to keep the tradition alive elsewhere. It is almost the same story we already told about a handful of quiet monks with a stubborn oil lamp playing out again in a completely different language on the opposite side of the world. And while all of that was unfolding in Baghdad over in China, printers working under the Tang dynasty had already produced a complete printed book nearly 1,000 years old, by our count a Buddhist scripture known today as the Diamond Sutra, carefully carved into wooden blocks, and printed in the year 868, its final page even carrying a note explaining it was made for free public distribution, centuries before a German goldsmith would ever set type by hand in Europe. Chinese officials were soon issuing paper currency, backed by the state moving actual coin off the roads, in favour of something lighter, easier, and far less tempting to bandits, while entire cities along the Chinese coast grew larger and more densely populated than almost anything Europe would produce for centuries afterward. None of this was hidden, forgotten, or waiting to be rediscovered by someone else later. It was simply happening quietly and continuously, on the other side of the globe from the man who decided to name an entire epoch after his own personal grief. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, maybe the last one I will ask you tonight. If someone judged your entire life by the worst week you ever had, ignoring every ordinary Tuesday, every quiet Sunday morning, every small private victory nobody else happened to notice, would that verdict feel remotely fair to you? That is essentially the verdict this whole era has been living under for the better part of 7 centuries, and after everything we've walked through together tonight, doesn't it feel almost strange that we ever accepted it so easily in the first place? Let's travel one more direction before we complete the circle, this time south, into the heart of West Africa, to an empire built on gold and salt. In the year 1324, a ruler named Mansa Musa, the Emperor of Mali, set out on a pilgrimage to Mecca, and by every surviving account he did not travel lightly. Chroniclers who watched his procession pass through Cairo described an almost impossibly long caravan of attendants, animals, and gold tens of thousands of people stretching for miles along the road. So much gold, according to those same chroniclers, that his generosity along the route noticeably affected the local price of the metal itself, handed out freely to beggars, merchants and rulers alike at every stop along the way. Modern historians treat the exact numbers passed down in those old accounts with healthy caution, the way we should treat any centuries-old boast, but the underlying pattern holds up remarkably well. A traveller named Ibn Battuta, passing through Cairo about a decade later on his own journeys, still found merchants complaining that the local economy had not fully recovered from one man's visit, a strange, almost funny kind of legacy to leave behind an entire city's currency, still feeling the aftershock of one especially generous tourist. Mansa Musa returned home and poured that same wealth into scholars, architects and mosques, transforming the city of Timbuktu into one of the great centres of learning anywhere on earth. A city where tens of thousands of students studied law, astronomy and theology inside libraries, holding an enormous private collection of manuscripts gathered from across the Islamic world and beyond, copied, annotated and passed down through families of scholars for generations. A city built almost entirely on knowledge and gold, thriving in the exact same century most of us were taught to picture as uniformly grim and unlettered. I think about that a lot, honestly, the sheer staggering scale of what we quietly agree to leave out of the picture. Not one flourishing civilization hiding somewhere off to the side of this story, but several running in parallel across different continents, different languages and different faiths, entirely unbothered by the fact that one grieving man half a world away had privately decided their whole century deserved to be remembered as a shadow. And that finally brings us back to exactly where we started this entire journey together all those hours ago now. A young man climbing a mountain in the south of France, opening a small book at random, and feeling for reasons he could not fully explain that something inside him had shifted. A poet weeping in the ruins of a city he loved, aching for a version of Rome he had only ever met through pages of old books, comparing his own century again and again to a golden age he had built entirely out of longing. A tired, homesick sentence tucked inside one private letter to one specific friend, never meant as a verdict on an entire world, and yet somehow strong enough to outlive its author by 700 years, picked up by an offended saint's biography here. A wounded national pride there, an angry churchman, a proud Enlightenment philosopher, until an entire millennium of human striving had been quietly filed away under one small, unfair word. He never once set foot in Baghdad. He never heard of Timbuktu. He never knew that a bishop in Lincoln was grinding lenses to understand light, or that a nun in Germany was correcting an emperor by mail, or that a small Adriatic city had already invented the very idea of quarantine before he was even born. He was simply one grieving man on one mountain, mourning one lost city, and somehow that private grief became the loudest voice in the entire room for 700 years, drowning out every quieter, truer voice standing right beside it. 12 different lies tonight, and every single one of them traced back once you actually went looking to something achingly human. A grieving poet missing a Rome he never actually inhabited. A dramatic novelist chasing a better story than the truth offered 3 centuries after the fact. A disease nobody understood yet arriving at exactly the wrong moment and frightening an entire culture into hiding. A statistic misunderstood by people who forgot to ask what an average actually means. A handful of monks quietly refusing to let a lamp go out one careful page at a time. An overworked costume designer up against a deadline reaching for the fastest silhouette he could find. A tourist industry discovering that fear sells better than accuracy, and building an entire attraction around a device that never existed. A legal document mistaken for the whole truth about half the population, while the messier paperwork told a far more interesting story. a folklorist's guess about a children's song repeated so often, it hardened into fact nobody thought to question. Not one single villain twirling a mustache in the shadows. Just ordinary people reaching for a story that felt true enough to keep and passing it forward without ever checking their work generation after generation, until we simply inherited the whole tangled thing as though it had always been true. Maybe that is the real gift sitting underneath everything we have uncovered together tonight. Not simply a corrected timeline or a longer list of facts to remember, but a small useful habit of mind you can carry with you long after you shut your eyes tonight. The next time an entire group of people, a whole century, an entire country gets flattened down into one single convenient word, it might be worth pausing just for a moment to ask who first said it and what they might have actually been grieving when they did. Thank you honestly for staying with me through this whole long winding journey tonight through mountains and manuscripts, opera houses and quarantine islands, queens and quiet monks, and one stubborn oil lamp that refused to go out. Whether you joined me right at the very first hook hours ago, or drifted off somewhere along the way and woke back up just in time for this last quiet stretch, I am simply glad you were here for some part of it. Stories like this one only really work when somebody's listening on the other end, and tonight that was you. If even one piece of tonight's story finds its way into a conversation of your own, sometime soon correcting a stranger gently over dinner, mentioning a bishop grinding lenses, or a nun scolding an emperor or a costume designer who accidentally invented an entire people's reputation, or simply changing the picture in your own head a little every time someone casually calls an entire era dark, then this whole story did exactly what I hoped it would do. And if tonight was your very first time here with me, welcome. There is always another mountain to climb together, another quiet monk, another forgotten queen, another comfortable old lie just waiting to be gently taken apart. So rest easy now and let your mind settle. The past was never as dark as we were told, and neither, I suspect, is tonight. Shut your eyes, let the story keep drifting quietly in the background if you like, and know that I will be right here waiting for you with another story the next time you need something gentle to carry you into the night.